Good evening and welcome to the Tuesday, April 21st regular meeting of the Walnut Creek City Council. This meeting is being held in accordance with the Brown Act as currently in effect under State Emergency Services Act, the Governor's Emergency Declaration related to COVID-19, and the Governor's Executive Order N-29-20 issued on March 17th, 2020, that allows attendance by members of the City Council, city staff, and the public to participate and conduct the meeting by teleconference. Teleconference locations are not open to the public. To provide a live remote public comment, join Zoom teleconference meeting ID 520-782-805. The password would be 111648. When we open public comment, please use, and you're waiting for your turn to speak, please use the raise hand feature, or if you're only connecting by audio, press *9 on your phone. That will alert our staff that you have a public comment you would like to provide. Please wait your turn, and once brought into the meeting, please state your name and your city of residence for the record. You will have 2 minutes to make your remarks. The next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Would you please join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Francois.
Here.
Councilmember Silva.
Here.
Councilmember Waddell.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Welk.
Here.
Mayor Haskew.
Here.
All council members are in attendance.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is a proclamation for National Library Week. And Alexandra, are you there? Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
I have a copy of the proclamation, and we'll figure out how to hand it to you sometime soon. I'm pleased to share with you there are approximately 10 items, but I have chosen a few of them because they highlight, I think, especially what libraries mean to our citizens in Walnut Creek. So whereas libraries have long served as trusted and treasured institutions where people of all ages, interests, and backgrounds can come together and learn alongside one another, whereas libraries offer members of the community a welcoming space and opportunities to explore new passions through technology, programs, and services, whereas library strives to develop and maintain programs and collections that are as diverse as the populations they serve, whereas libraries are a resource for all members of the community, regardless of race, ethnicity, creed, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, or socioeconomic status, by offering services and educational program that transforms lives and strengthen communities. They also do an amazing number of other things. They are the center of our community, and we appreciate so much the value that they add to our community. Now, therefore, be it resolved that I, Luella Haskew, proclaim National Library Week, April 19th through 25th, 2020. During this time, I encourage all residents to make a virtual visit to the library, a place where they can all belong and discover who we are. Because of you, the librarians in our libraries transform. Alexandra, would you like to say a few words?
I would, yes. Thank you, Mayor Haskew, and thank you, City Council members, for that wonderful opportunity. I'm the new manager at the Ignacio Valley Library, and it's wonderful to see you all. I look forward to talking to you in person sometime. I just wanted to highlight a few of the amazing services that the library is doing to take care of our community during this shelter in place. So we have started putting up some wonderful live storytime events. We're hosting them through our Facebook. And you can go and check out librarians reading their favorite stories every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. We have also instituted chat, so we have librarians standing by from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. to answer any questions, whether it's about the library or information about the city or the county. Anyone can send in messages, and we've got library staff ready to go. We have also been heavily promoting our ebooks and e-audiobooks, as well as our digital magazines and our streaming movie services. So you'll see a lot of posts on our social media about that, and we've been creating a lot of staff suggested reading, watching lists that link directly to accessed materials that everyone can use from home with their library card. And we're continuing to put a lot of services online, look for more adult programming, more DIY art stuff, mindful meditation. So we're really trying to bring the library to the community. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and thank all your coworkers and all the people who help make libraries such a valuable asset for our community. I'm clapping.
Thank you.
As I'm sure everybody else is. Thank you. The next item on our agenda
Did we lose the mayor?
Who's the mayor? Okay, well.
There she is.
the mayor's back.
Oh, okay.
Hi. The next item on our agenda is an update on COVID-19.
Yes, I'll jump in here. Dan Buckshire, City Manager. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So this will be our second COVID update. Some of what you will hear is a recap from what you heard last time, as some of the conditions have not changed, but I think it warrants reviewing again to help get the word out about what's occurring. And then we do have some new information to share. And as a reminder, one of my key roles as city manager, possibly the most important, that fortunately I don't have to use very often, is to serve as your emergency services director. And that is the role in which I am acting this evening, certainly for this presentation. Joining me after I give a general overview, we will hear from our police captain, Steve Gorski, who will give an update on PD activities and an overview of what's occurring from a law enforcement perspective in the community. And then lastly, we will hear from Terry Kilgore, our assistant city manager, who leads our economic development program in Walnut Creek, and she'll talk about what's occurring from an economic perspective, not only downtown, but throughout our entire commercial base, if you will. So with that, if we could move to the next slide. We are obviously still under basically a shelter-in-place order that requires us to stay at home as long as possible. That initially was put in place March 17th through April 7th. It was then extended to May 3rd, which is not that far away, a couple weeks. And we are waiting to hear from our county public health officer about what will happen next. As I think most of us are aware, the 6 county Bay Area public health officers have been coordinating a unified approach to the measures to put in place related to COVID-19 for the entire Bay Area as a region. At this point, we anticipate that is still going to occur. I and other city managers do have a conference call with the public health director this Thursday, so we are hoping to gain some insight as to where we are headed. That said, I fully anticipate at least some version of shelter in place will remain in place beyond May 3rd, likely considerably beyond May 3rd. but we don't know if they will be if the orders will be lightened or modified in some way. That is what we are waiting to hear. In addition, as you can see on this slide, there was a declaration of national emergency made by the president, and then obviously proclamations of emergency were made at the state, regional, and city level. If we go to the next slide, please. One of the key aspects of the public health directive and order is that only essential services are allowed to be conducted in person, and as much as possible should be performed remotely, preferably from one's home. That does apply to our city operations. We are not exempt from that order. We must comply with it just like everybody else. As such, over the last several weeks, we have completely reconfigured how we provide services to the community. Essentially, the only services that we are providing in person, as you can see here, are police services, which we have modified our operations to help support social distancing, not only for our officers, but for the public safety. And Captain Gorski will speak to those in more detail during his segment of this presentation. We do have some of our public works employees who are out and about maintaining our infrastructure, as well as some of our, landscaping and parks or whatnot. We have dialed that back. We are not maintaining at the same level we were, again, to help protect the health of the community and our workers. And then the essential service order does allow for a limited amount of construction activity. Those projects related to affordable housing and to healthcare infrastructure facilities are allowed to proceed. Also, projects that were midway, under construction, but are not in a safe condition yet and need to be buttoned up, if you will, those are being allowed to proceed. And as such, we have our inspectors who are out in the field inspecting those projects as appropriate. We have equipped all of our folks who are out in the field with the necessary personal protection equipment. There are obviously some challenges obtaining some of those supplies, but we seem to be doing okay for now. Things have leveled out in that regard a little bit after there was the panic buy nationwide, if you will. We could flip to the next slide, please. So, as in summary here, as you can see, all of our facilities are closed for in-person operations, and only our open space and effectively our police operations are open in the public. That does mean, as you can see here, our playgrounds are closed, our golf course is closed, the library, although we don't operate that, we do have a partnership with the county, and we just heard from our librarian. Those services are being provided remotely as well. And we will talk about ramp up in the future at a future update. We are starting to think about, as the orders will be lifted, I should say lightened first at some point and subsequently lifted sometime thereafter, of how do we phase back in our operations to provide in person. And what I would imagine at this point we're working through is those types of services that better lend themselves to social distancing would be open first. So as an example, something like tennis or golf, where you can space people out, very limited interaction, would be more likely to open sooner than, say, the leisure center for a big production in which we would have a large number of people in a more confined space. We may be able to configure the leisure to better comply with social distancing, but it would obviously be more difficult. So that's just one example. There are many others to give you a sense. We go to the next slide. In terms of reconfiguring operations, that is certainly no small feat. And I do want to give a shout out to our IT folks who have done a tremendous job of supporting our organization. About 80% of our workforce is working from home, to give you a sense of that. And while we had a lot of infrastructure in place to support that, we put it on steroids, if you will, and it has gone very smoothly. So I can assure you there's a lot of adjustment to working in remotely, but it's going, I think, about as smoothly as we could have hoped. In addition to the resources that I mentioned, I do want to clarify that we are, open for business, just in a different version. And in particular, we are open for business in our development services. So effectively, everything that can be done through the land use planning and entitlement process can still occur up to the point of issuing a construction permit, a building permit. which if the project happens to be for affordable housing or healthcare infrastructure, that could occur as well. And I am pleased to report that we are still seeing a strong amount of interest in future projects for Walnut Creek. A lot of developers of multiple sizes have continued with their project. We're reviewing plans, reviewing proposals, and we've had a few new ones come in recently over the last few weeks and to discuss potential concepts going forward. So I think that, a way to view that is there are a lot of developers that are using this downtime to plan for the future, for the reopening, so they're ready to go. So in an ideal world, once we get the green light, we may see a bit of a building boom, depending what's happening in the broader economy, obviously, but we will have a lot of projects that are ready to hit the ground, if you will. Do you want to point out our webpage, and we'll show more information on that later in this presentation, but we do have a lot of key resources, kind of one-stop shop, where folks can go to learn about what's occurring in the county, in Walnut Creek, as well as links to other resources. And then very importantly, we know we have a large senior population in Walnut Creek. Obviously, we have Rossmore, in which we have an over 55 community of about 10,000 residents. And we do have a fair number of seniors who are located elsewhere in the community. We have dedicated resources to support Rossmore specifically. And we have created a senior hotline where folks can call in for support. And I may have reported on this last time, but with the most common calls are support in obtaining groceries, particularly in the beginning. Now that grocery stores have modified their operations to better support takeout, if you will, and or delivery of groceries, not as much demand, but still a fair bit. And then also folks wanting to obtain medications. We've been helping them with that. And then more from a softer side, if you will, lending a helping hand. There are some folks who are just feeling very isolated, and they're calling to really just to talk to somebody. And so we have folks can help them through this difficult time frame as well. And I'm very proud that we're able to offer that type of service. Next slide, please. In terms of, I hit on some of this already, as we made our adjustments to our operations, we obviously, not only in terms of what we're providing to the community, but we have to think about our organization in terms of what are we doing with our workforce and how are we treating our employees? And we are trying to be very supportive during what's a difficult time, and yet face and address our financial realities that we are having to deal with. As I mentioned, a majority of our city employees are working from home. Broke out into different categories. We have about 20% that are working in person. Out of the other 80%, about 60% of those can work at home, and there are about 20% that are unable to do their work at home, if you will. So those folks, we did pay everybody through April 7th. The reason being is when the order was thought to be March 17th through April 7th, 3-week period, we were adjusting our operations. We paid all employees during that time frame. However, when the orders were extended, we did reduce hours and or furlough all of our temporary employees, which is about 180 employees, which is the equivalent of 65 full-time positions. And then we have about 10% of our permanent workforce that is unable to work from home and has had a reduction in hours or effectively furloughed. And they are not being paid for this time frame of April 8th through May 3rd. They are able to use their accumulated leave balances. They may be eligible for the federal emergency sick leave or FMLA, or they could proceed with and apply for unemployment for which they would qualify, or they could take leave without pay, or the different options for our employees. And what we tried to do is create a menu of options so that folks could choose the option that best suits their personal circumstance. Some may want to use all of their leave now. Some may want to spread it out over time. Some may want to pursue unemployment. Some may not, depending upon their particular circumstance. And then we have been working diligently, nose to the grindstone, if you will, for the last several weeks, trying to assess the financial impacts to our city budget based upon the sharp downturn in the economy. And we're clearly in a recession and what that means for us. And our last agenda item on tonight's council meeting, we will review that in considerable detail. I do want to add that from an employee perspective, that we are all disaster service workers. And as such, we have been reallocating many of our employees. There are several of us who are effectively spending 100% of our time working on COVID-19 related matters, which means we've had to shift duties around to other folks. In addition, should there be a need to put folks into the field or change our duties in some way, we could call in any of our employees to do that. What's a bit unique about this natural disaster is that the best thing we can do is nothing, more or less. Compare that with an earthquake or a fire where we have a lot of folks mobilized to help with emergency response as well as recovery efforts. Obviously, the best thing we can all do is stay at home and work from home. And then shifting to my second to last slide here, I believe it was our last council meeting that we received the update from schools that the physical campuses are closed for the remainder of the year, but students are working from home. And I can assure everyone, being a parent with a middle schooler and an elementary students at home, that anyone who's working home gets to play part-time teacher too. So it's other duties as required, but based on what I've observed, I think our schools have adjusted nicely to being able to support our students remotely and trying to get access to computers. My understanding is I think 98% of students in the Mount Diablo district, as an example, do have access to the appropriate technology, and they're looking to fill that remaining 2% to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to learn remotely. Since our last update, the county health officers did require that we wear a mask effectively or some type of face covering when we are out in public. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to review what's occurring to review the health dashboard at cchealth.org, which is part of the Contra Costa County website. Census, obviously this is census time, and Council Member Silva has been our representative for the census. And we've really had to change our approach. We were planning on hitting the pavement, if you will, during this time frame to help raise awareness on the census. And there's a lot of discussion about how to adjust, possibly delay the timing of the census so that we can obtain an accurate count and yet still keep folks safe. And then today, I've not heard the outcome. I don't know if the Board of Supervisors is still deliberating. They were starting at 1:30 today. They are considering a county-wide moratorium on evictions and rent increases, as you can see here, for commercial and residential tenants. The initial option they were considering is truly countywide, including unincorporated areas, as well as those within city limits, what are referred to as incorporated areas. So we will wait the outcome, and if we receive info on that here before too long, we will report as appropriate. And then a couple other slides here, if we can go to the next one. So we also have heard from the governor that there is a joint approach with our neighbors to the north in Oregon and Washington for how do we reopen and how is that going to look. I think what's most important that they emphasize very clearly is it will be a science-based approach, and they want to see that different milestones are met and that different phases of reopening will occur based upon those milestones. So they want one to monitor, the ability to monitor and protect, obviously prevent infection in high-risk populations. We have the capacity, be able to support physical distancing, and then based upon data and triggers that may come into play, that we may have to reinstitute shelter-in-place options going forward. So I don't think this is an all or nothing, meaning that we go from sheltering in place to life going back to normal. What this means is we will see different phases over time, and we may have to go back to more restrictive measures after things are lightened, depending upon what happens with the spread of the virus until either a vaccine is created or we ultimately get to what is referred to as herd immunity for not only California and the Bay Area and California, but really throughout the country and throughout the world. A couple of things I wanted to mention before I hand this off to Captain Gorski on the next slide. I did mention that we have created our COVID-19 emergency team, which is effectively our executive team, and our Deputy City Manager, Carla Hansen, who is working on all of our COVID-related issues. We created a set of principles and a set of decision-making criteria to help us work through this. We obviously have our city's mission, vision, and values, which are our overall foundation, and these are specific to this particular incident. It's a somewhat common practice and a best practice to put these types of principles in decision-making guidance in place specific to an emergency. I'm not going to read through these all of these rather, but on this first slide, you can see what I think is really important is that we are truly all in this together in order to solve this challenge and this crisis. Humanity throughout the world is going to have to come together to help take care of one another. That we put the well-being of people first with caring and compassion. Next slide, please. Now we trust that people have good intentions and be willing to verify, and that we really need to take the needs and concerns of all stakeholders into consideration. This is a complex issue. There are people who are going to be impacted differently, as we'll hear on the economic update. While overall the economy is down and businesses are hurting, there are some businesses that are doing just fine and some businesses that are actually have seen an uptick in their operations. So we need to be mindful of those challenges, or those dynamics, if you will. Next slide. This next one on this first bullet is something I want to hit here. This first bullet on this next slide. The last sentence is, be willing to make decisions without all of the information. And that's something that is challenging. And as this issue proceeds, the decisions are only going to become more difficult. And we're accustomed to, in many cases, particularly in matters that come before the city council, to flesh out as many of the details as possible so that we can all make, and particularly the council can make well-informed decisions when dealing with some difficult and challenging circumstances. Unfortunately, we're not in that dynamic. We're flying, we don't have a crystal ball. In some areas, we are flying a little blind, just like many others in this situation. And so you will be hearing us this evening on the financial update that there's a lot we don't know. We are making estimates and our best forecasting, if you will, but nobody does have a crystal ball. And then that this is not business as usual. We need to keep an open mind and be flexible, and that we recognize that normal may not be what it was prior to COVID-19. And if it is, it's going to be quite some time before we're back in a normal state. Next slide, please. And then we have been taking this approach with respect to decision-making in priority order. And this portion may need to evolve a bit over time, but as this outbreak was increasing, and it's debatable right now whether we are still increasing in terms of exposures, whether we are at peak or past peak, and we don't quite know that yet. But first and foremost is that protecting public health is most important, in that we are complying with the public health orders and helping to enforce those orders. We obviously want to minimize the negative impacts to the community and to our employees, that we need to think externally and internally. We obviously want to address economic issues. And this last one really comes down to balance, in that we do need to make decisions that are more short-term in nature and get us through this crisis, but at the same time, position us well for the longer run. We don't want to make decisions that are really going to be more painful than necessarily and put us in a difficult position in the longer term. And obviously this is going to be very challenging, not knowing what the future holds. And then lastly is really specific to our resource allocation in terms of utilizing our existing budget goals and policies. They were crafted a few years ago, and they are just as applicable during good times as they are in challenging times. And we want to make sure we continue to use those. And with that, I am going to pause to see if you have any questions for me before Captain Gorski takes it away.
Council members, do you have any questions, comments, questions? I don't see anybody raising a hand. Oh, yes, I do.
I was trying to find my virtual hand.
Yes.
Thanks, Dan. So in terms of Walnut Creek opening up in any respect, whether as loose as just the parks or even more so, are we really taking all of our direction from the county on this?
Yes. So they are the ones who are issuing the health orders. We are obliged to follow. We are providing feedback to them in terms of the impact to the cities, and I will give the county a lot of credit. The health department has been very accessible. They are listening to what not only, I'm sure, cities and other agencies have to say, but members of the public, members of the business community, taking that into consideration and then making their decisions. But ultimately, we do have a little bit of discretion at this point, but not much. I would suspect that as the orders are lightened over time, we may have more discretion about what we're able to open up or not. But one of the aspects and the approach that the Bay Area has taken intentionally is to have a uniform approach. So as of now, there is very little discretion about what we open and what we close, and that's intentional from the 6 Bay Area health officers.
Okay, thanks. And the second question is, I know that LA and the Southern California counties seem to operate on something of their own. And is the intention that the Bay Area will work in some kind of coordination with Southern California so that it's a cohesive California effort, whichever way this goes? Or are we truly going to operate on our own where we could end up doing things very differently than Southern California?
I think right now it's the latter. Obviously, we do have some directives from the state, and those are the minimum standards in which then counties or cities, regions, if you will, can enact more restrictive orders beyond that and measures. And so I think it really depends going forward what our county views as our challenges compared to other areas, and whether we will evolve to more of a true statewide approach or whether we will still have a regional approach. I would anticipate it will be more regional, at least for a period of time, and then we may migrate to a statewide approach. But candidly, that's speculation on my part.
Thank you.
Mayor. Thank you. Yes, I acknowledge Councilmember Silva. But before we go there, I cannot see all of the council, so I request that you use your virtual raise hand so that I know when you are ready for questions. I think now, Councilmember Silva, please proceed.
I have a question and also a piece of information. The supervisors passed a countywide moratorium, and there are other details involved in it, but they did finish that probably while we've been talking here. Dan, a question. Okay, got it. Well, I got that message. Come back to me.
All right. Councilmember Francois has a question, so we'll go to him next. And then if you need me, you remember your question now?
Yes, I did. I had a question yesterday as to whether are we as a city doing testing and tracing?
We as a city, in terms of our operations, are not. That is headed up by the county, and they're also working with private providers who are doing testing to coordinate that information. It's my understanding that the information that is on the county's website, which again is cchealth.org, compiles the information not only from the laboratories run by the county, but also those tests being conducted by private providers, so that we have a more holistic look. That was not the case a few weeks ago. It was only the testing from the county's facility itself, but now it's been synthesized and is being reported as such. But no, we do not operate. Public health is directly not within our city's purview in terms of providing those services. Cities, per actually the state constitution, are empowered with that authority and responsibility.
You mean counties are empowered? You said cities.
County. Oh, I meant counties. Yeah.
Which hat are you wearing today? Okay, so because the governor has at the 6-point plan, it's really about testing, and then ultimately testing and tracing and basically monitoring how it's going is a key element of being able to open up. That will be in the hands of the public health authorities in the 58 counties, essentially.
That's correct. And I would point something out, and it's kind of an interesting dynamic. Having worked at a county previously, county health officers, the public health officers, actually have dual responsibilities. They report up through the county for some of their responsibilities and are under budgetary authority from the County Board of Supervisors. However, many of their responsibilities and their direct authority is authorized through the state, and they do not report up through the Board of Supervisors with respect to their public health role, particularly in this type of situation. And the idea is that we have medical doctors that are public health officers who are making these types of decisions, and not an elected governmental entity. And so that is structured by design. It is not the County Board of Supervisors that is making the call with respect to these orders. It is the public health officers themselves.
Thank you, Dan.
Matt, do you still have a question?
I do. It's related to Councilmember Silva's question, and thank you in general for the update. Dan, do you have any sense for how the testing will be rolled out at a state and countywide level, just as a matter of public information? Is that something that you'll go to your doctor or CVS to get tested for, or is that information not known yet?
Well, it's in process. You know, that's the issue of the day, is testing and getting enough tests out there for everybody to hit the targets. To give you a sense of scale, the goal for the state, but the governor's goal is to have the capacity to test 25,000 individuals a day by the end of this month. I don't think we're there yet. And then it ratchets up from there, getting up to goals are over 100,000 a day. Candidly, I don't recall the exact time frame for those different milestones, but there is a big push for testing so that anybody who would need a test could effectively go get one, which is not the case currently.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you also can just speak kind of briefly on the impacts to the business community, stores, restaurants, hotels.
Yeah, it's significant. I'll defer some of the detailed response to your question to Terry when she covers the economic impact piece. But, the vast majority of our businesses are closed, certainly in downtown, but throughout the city, not just downtown. What you'll hear in the financial update tonight is we're anticipating during the shelter in place period that our sales taxes will drop between 75 to 80% until the orders are lifted and people are out and about more. And we're also anticipating hotel visitation and revenue generated from hotel rooms is virtually dropped to zero during this time frame. And so it's significant. And again, we'll provide more detail on during the last agenda item this evening.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not seeing anybody else wave a hand. So next on the agenda for you, for this component of the agenda is whom?
Captain Steve Gorski, so take it away, Steve.
Hi, Madam Mayor, council members, and folks from the community watching. Just to let everybody know, the public safety situation in Walnut Creek is good, all things considered. Calls for service continue to be lower than average. We are still finding people out there that are trying to take advantage of what's going on. We are still making contacts, making arrests, but in general, calls for service are down. We continue to operate, and Susie, if you could bring up those slides, we continue to operate under a model that compartmentalizes our staff as much as possible, starting with our patrol and our dispatch personnel. Those are really the core functions of the police department that have to be here and have to be working. Even though they have to be here, we're still taking steps to make sure that we're minimizing the chance that large numbers of personnel would have to be quarantined if we have a potential exposure. Part of the plan to do that is the way we're handling our deployment of our patrol folks. And we have patrol teams that are using social distancing, that are in some cases working from home, in some cases being on call, and really finding ways to not interact with other patrol officers that work on the opposite side of the week or different shifts. Again, that really minimizes our exposure in the event that one of our officers does come in contact with somebody that's positive for COVID-19. Routine patrols do continue. We're operating under a model that really prioritizes high visibility for the community. We are getting increased calls for service, although generally calls for service are down. The calls related to the stay-at-home order and violations of said order are increasing incremental. We're up to about 5 to 10 calls on an average day. That could be people in the parks, people doing business that they're not supposed to be doing, and everything to include construction and gardeners and that type of thing. We are taking an approach that really emphasizes education and warnings, but we are issuing citations when necessary. Those are very rare, but we are starting to issue citations in more extreme cases. Some of business, like everything we're doing at the city, is continuing. The Chiefs Advisory Board is still going to meet on April 30th. They're going to do a Zoom, a teleconference meeting for the advisory board. We also are doing a lot of regional collaboration. Just like we're having challenges in public safety, the courts are having challenges, our jails are having challenges, and obviously our neighboring cities in the county. We're really trying to maximize our regionalization to come up with ways, for example, with the courts being largely shut down, finding ways to still get the priority cases to the DA's office, into the court system for the folks that actually have to end up going to jail and have, say, a preliminary hearing. So there's a lot of sort of ad hoc response to this, and we're working hand in hand with our partners at the local level, at the county level, and even statewide. And then the last thing I'll highlight here, you can see the picture of a member of the community that donated homemade masks to our personnel here in the police department. We are seeing just an absolute outpouring of generosity from the community. We're seeing almost daily food donations from people, donations of personal protective equipment like masks, and also from the corporate world. Quite honestly, some of the people that we deal with and some that we never have contact with are reaching out, offering to make donations of food and equipment. So that's really great to see. We're really trying to highlight it on social media. So if you don't follow the police department on Facebook or Instagram, we're really trying to give a shout out to those members of our community, especially our restaurants, mainly in the downtown area, that are being very generous. And that's all for the public safety part of the presentation, unless anybody has any questions.
I don't see any questions from any of the council members. So I'm going to guess that, Terry, you're next up.
Yes, ma'am, you are correct. I am Terry Kilgore, Assistant City Manager, here to provide an update on the economic impacts as best as we can discern them. And I put that caveat in place because at this point, the best data we have right now is on unemployment figures. And if you could forward the slide, that'd be great. As Dan noted, the continued shelter-in-place order restricts which businesses are allowed to function as essential businesses. That's resulted in a lot of dark storefronts, especially general retailers. But what we are seeing is that many of our restaurants and even some of our retailers have gotten very creative and adapted. They're offering specials. They're moving more to an online business model, focusing on delivery and takeout. But it's obviously difficult when people can't come out and visit. And that they are also implementing a lot of job cuts. We're starting to see our WARN notices that we talked about last council meeting roll in. Overall, nationally, we're at 22 million jobless claims in 4 weeks' time. For context, it took us 18 months to get to 15 million jobs lost in the Great Recession. So we are setting highs that no one had ever hoped to set. And more than 10% of those jobs lost are in the state of California. So we are definitely at the epicenter with the focus on tourism and our love of eating out because we have great food. So we are definitely starting to see the impacts of those jobless claims. Overall, the bear market continues. The Dow is still down more than 20%. And this is leading to an overall drain on economic activity. We are obviously kind of the lagging indicator. So as go our retailers and our hotels, so go we. Sales tax revenues are just a little bit over 25% of city revenues, and we'll talk more about that as we talk about our financial forecast. But we get late data. We do expect, as Dan mentioned earlier, a deficit in the current fiscal year of about $10 million. And then we're continuing, as the situation continues to evolve, to update our timing and our trends analysis for how we think we might recover. One of the things that I would note that's going to make that difficult is where the state has taken action to support businesses by deferring sales tax submittals, some into July of 2021. Obviously, that has a fiscal impact, but what it also does is it keeps us from having good data on how our businesses are faring and how different segments of our business economy are being impacted. So at this point, we're having to do a lot of grassroots reconnaissance, relying pretty heavily on anecdotal stories. But as we get better and better data, we'll be sure that to share with you. One bright spot was today, Chipotle posted stronger earnings than anyone expected as a national corporation, which leads to one of the comments someone made earlier, which is people still want to eat out. If you're not a great cook, there's still a desire to eat something besides your own cooking. And those businesses that are adapting to that new reality are faring a little better than those that are not able to. Next slide, please. So what's new in our business assistance world? We do know some local businesses are beginning to see SBA loans issued under the CARES Act. It's been a bit of a mixed bag. Again, that's anecdotal. And unfortunately, the funding has all been used up. We are hoping for an additional round, but that's up to the Congress to decide. Later this evening, you're going to have two items before you. One is the Walnut Creek Downtown Board is asking to go forward with the structure of the bid, but defer the due date of payments to September to give businesses a little time and a little breathing room on those payments. And we are asking as a city staff to do the same thing with our business licensing deadline, is to push that back a quarter. On the open business list, we mentioned last council meeting on the city webpage. This highlights open essential businesses. I'm excited to tell you we have 163 businesses listed as open and active. And we've had 13,600 page visits. So people are actually using the site, and the new map-based search feature has gotten pretty good reviews. We are partnering with the Chamber and Walnut Creek Downtown to put out signs that say open for business for those businesses that are posted on our open business site to get them a little more visibility, hopefully to show that they're open and serving customers. And those should start going out this week. And then as we look forward, our focus is on how are we going to be preparing to help our businesses reopen, whether that's existing businesses, how are we going to help them ramp up their marketing and let people know that they are ready to accept customers as this shelter-in-place orders lift, as well as how will we welcome new businesses that may be interested in opening in our city. And if any of you have creative ideas, we'd love to hear them. We're starting to build our game plan around that. And lastly, I would share with you, staff sent me some details on the county moratorium. One of the higher scoring elements that we've been hearing about on social media is an interest on a commercial moratorium. And the ordinance was passed by the county, and it does cover both residential and commercial. It gives a 120-day grace period. And the ordinance right now is intended to stay in place until May 31st, 2020, applying countywide, both in unincorporated Contra Costa as well as in cities. That they did leave a provision that cities could adopt more generous ordinances that would then supersede the county ordinance. But in an absence of city actions, the county ordinance prevails. So we'll have an even deeper recap for you here within the next few days on what we think that will mean to our business community. So with that, I leave it for your questions.
Council members, any questions? I'm not seeing, yes, I am seeing somebody, but they need to unmute. Council member Silva.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Terry. I appreciate the additional detail on the Board of Supervisors and what they adopted today. How do you think we would interpret a 120-day grace period? Would that be 120 days from when someone says, I can't pay, or 120 days beyond May 31st?
Let me read you the actual language my staff sent me. It says other forms of relief include a grace period of 120 days for a tenant to pay back rent from the termination of the ordinance and a prohibition on late fees for late rent. So it's 120 days from May 31.
Thank you. And I appreciate, by the way, your mention of what I'll call an economic recovery plan and what we will need to do in partnership with the business community. And I hope we think about bringing some of the people that worked with us on the downtown enhancement initiative, some of those people together for ideas. It's not just about us and the chamber and these entities, but also it's people who are right in the mix day to day.
That's a great point. Yes, it's going to be all hands on deck for sure as we come out
The
of this.
sooner we get talking about it, the better.
Mhm.
Social distancing as our goal. Next is Councilmember Francois.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Terry, for the update. I'm particularly encouraged by the efforts that the city is making to reach out to the business community, to try to let people know they're open for business and continue in those efforts. I'm aware that other cities are deferring the transient occupancy tax. That's the tax, an extra tax that's charged on hotel rooms that goes to the cities. Would there be a process to do that in Walnut Creek, and what would that look like?
I'm looking at City Attorney Steve Mattis to see if he'd like to chime in.
So the city council, the current city ordinances do not provide for an extension of the tax that's paid, and recall also that the tax is actually paid by the hotel occupants. The hotels really serve as a trustee for that tax until it gets paid over to the city. If the council were interested in granting extension beyond the current time period for submission, and so presently on a quarterly basis, the hotels are required to submit the tax 30 days after the end of the quarter. So for the March 31 quarter, they have to submit by April 30. If the council wanted to extend that time period, then the most expedient way to do that would be for the council to ask staff to bring back a further amendment to the emergency declaration to allow for a suspension. The current ordinance does not vest in staff the authority to grant any extension of that type. That would have to take council action.
When we looked at this, just as context, for the last quarter of this fiscal year, so April through June, we projected no TOT would be coming into the city, just based on the shutdown of most functions at hotels. So the timing of this is important. If we act soon and we defer the Q3 payment, the maximum impact would be $540,000 due that we'd be deferring into fiscal year 21. I put a caveat on that because some hotels pay monthly, and though any payments made have not been deducted out of that $540,000 yet. So that's a very rough estimate at this point.
Do you have an estimate for what the Q1 TOT estimated revenue is?
I do. If you'll give me just a moment, staff sent that over. It's normally about $700,000 a quarter on average, and they estimated we'd be getting about half, so $350 in Q1.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Comments? Now I think it's time for public comment, and we will go on to the city clerk, who will check to see if any public comment can only be in regard to this item or any information presented in this item. City clerk, do you see anybody that is open or interested in making a comment?
We have one person.
Yes.
Or we have a few. We'll bring them in one at a time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is user SMJ337A.
Working on it. I'm having a little trouble. Can
have
you
2
hear me
minutes.
now?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Hey, Terry, thank you very much for the presentation. That's actually what I used to do as a software developer for Irwin Home Equity and Bank of America and places like that. I've read the same data that you're working on for years because I used to do modeling. Today, though, Terry, you said you want to support businesses. If the city can pull it up, I used to have a business license called the Clone Zone. And only in this meeting, I'll go light on it. But I run a blog that can help you. But it's stuck. And so this morning, I plugged in front of the city, and I was really happy to have my monitor and my laptop. How it got broken is a different story, but it was broken. So I'm stuck with a monitor and a partially broken laptop that still functions. I run a blog called BayAreaHomeless.com, and I have another one about sightseeing. That's going to be very much of a big success for me when I get it. I'm not going to bring it up what it is. I've been working on these blogs for years in between a lot of major setbacks. With my Bay Area Homeless site, I'd like some support because I'm going to break it down county by county with all the resources and make it pretty flexible. I'm in front of the library today, or not the library, in City Hall, and the restroom showed up. Oh, by the way, I'm homeless. That's who I am, homeless. A homeless businessman on Walnut Creek. And then for 2 hours, I had power, and then the rest show up, and then Core brings us some food because we're struggling out here. It's cold. And then you come and cut my power. I have no place to go. I barely have anything, any safety at all. And the only place I had a plug and a table at the same time was disconnected. I don't know how you want to support businesses here, but my story is unbelievable. Mr. Gorski knows, or Captain Gorski knows it. So I'd like some support because I want to try to help people no matter how bad my life gets.
Thank you. Your time is up. Or is there another person?
Yes. We'll be bringing in Jillian Standish.
Thank you.
Jillian,
Yeah, yes.
go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Is this the public comment time for everything or just for, I was not.
Jillian, it's just for the update that we had on COVID-19.
Okay, I'm sorry. I want to comment later. I'm sorry. This is my first time. So.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay, we'll be bringing in user Safari Kid. Oh, there they go.
Hi. Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. If you could please state your name and city of residence for the record.
All right. This is Satish, my city residence is San Ramon, but we have two businesses in city of Walnut Creek. And I attended the meeting last week, 2 weeks back, and attending this one as well. I want to appreciate all the council members and mayor for hearing our point of view and taking in note. And the news just now in this meeting came about the commercial rent moratorium. That's a huge for us. That gives us a lifeline to survive. And we will be looking forward for more guidance from the city as businesses open more and more. And we certainly like to work with the city, and we appreciate everyone in this meeting, especially Cindy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All righty. On to, did you have somebody else?
No, that was it.
Okay, so we're going to bring it back to council. Does council have any additional questions or comments? I am seeing one from Council Member Francois, or did you not? Nope.
I did. I was trying to get trained to lower my virtual hand as well. But I'm really impressed with our staff and the amount of effort that they're doing to keep the community informed of what's going on, the outreach they're doing to the business community, and the interactions they're having at the state, federal levels are extremely impressive. I would like to just put this out there for council consideration, but we have, I think, particular segments of our business community that are especially hard hit, the retailers and the hotels. And I think we could make, through just a minimal effort on our part, additional assistance available to the hotels in regard to deferring the Q1 payment of that extra tax, that transient occupancy tax, for a period of 90 days. And it's, relatively speaking, it's not a huge amount of money, but I think it's especially needed at this point. And we're talking about deferring, not forgiving it. So I just want to put that out there because I would be interested in directing staff to come back with an amendment to the emergency ordinance along the lines of what the city attorney had outlined.
Okay, thank you. That, I guess, requires that we get some comment on Matt's statement. So does anybody have a further support or other presentation? Justin?
Sure, I'm in 100% agreement. I think that we probably should have done this prior to this meeting. I think that this is a very easy thing that we can implement that has very little impact economically or financially to the city, and eventually we'll get the money back anyway. So anything that we can do to assist our businesses to move forward, especially our hotels, and hopefully keep as many people as employed as possible, I think would be a great thing for the community to do.
Thank you. And I see a hand for Mayor Pro Tem Wilk.
I certainly understand the sentiment of this. The only reservation I have really is when I have my own business, you keep sales tax, or in this case, TOT, in a separate bucket, and you're not using that for ongoing operating expenses and cash flow. As we said, it's a small amount, and it's going to be coming back to the city anyway. But it sounds like if we're doing this deferment, it means the hotels will be using that for their ongoing cash flow, and which is, of course, just a bad practice in general. But it really does make me wonder then if that's something the city gets back down the line. If we're doing this for whatever it is, 5 or 6 or 7 hotels, as opposed to something that is going to benefit the overall business community with something that would attract customers to spend more money, I don't see how deferring the TOT, while it would absolutely maybe help the hotels a little bit, again, I guess with some of their cash flow, which is not a good principle. It's not like they're going to be advertising this as a way to bring in new customers. I'm just not sure this actually helps increase business overall, but I certainly understand the sentiment of it.
Isn't it the same thing that the state has done relating to sales tax deferment? I mean, it's very equivalent, and the hotels don't really have any sales tax that they are paying into the system. I think this would be very equivalent to that.
I think that's right, Justin. I think it's a gesture, maybe more than anything else, but I think it's very much akin to the sales tax deferral for small businesses.
Again, I can understand that. I just wanted to express my concerns about it.
Okay, Dan, do you have any comments?
So, oh, I'm sorry. I had a comment and I can't figure out how to use so somebody tell me how to click on and off the hand. That would be helpful.
So if you go to the participant box and make the participant list show up,
Yes.
then down at the bottom is a raise your hand switch. Can you find it? You have the list of participants?
Yes.
Okay, do you see on the very bottom on the right-hand side?
I see it. It was hidden. Thank you.
Okay, and I keep switching back to where I can see everybody, but I think I get my Zoom switches me back to when I can't. So I'm going to rely pretty heavily on that. I'm going to pull rank and I am going to ask Councilmember Silva to go next and then the City Manager, Mr. Buckshot. Okay.
So, thank you, Mayor. I agree with everyone's sentiments, but what the state has done is for small businesses, and it's for, under $50,000 in payments. Our hotels are part of chains, and they have a large marketing organization nationally and internationally that supports all them. I would think we would be helping our business community more if we said, okay, we're going to take those collections and we're going to dedicate them to economic recovery plans. That's an investment in our business community. And so I tend to agree with Kevin.
All right, City Manager Buckshot.
Yeah, Dan Buckshot, City Manager. I just wanted to offer up some information and additional detail for your council's consideration as you debate this matter. So from a numbers perspective, we have a transient occupancy tax, which is actually one of the lowest in the region, if not the state, as an aside. It generates about 2.2 million a year. In addition, what was passed a few years ago is what's called a Tourism Business Improvement District, or a TBID. And that money is raised, it generates about somewhere between $1.2 and $1.4 million a year. It actually just doubled a year ago when the hoteliers sought to increase that amount. And the way that works, that is a surcharge separate from the TOT. And to clarify, the TOT is paid for by those who visit a hotel. It's not paid for by the businesses. So they collect it when you check into a hotel, you pay that tax as a person who's renting it or utilizing the hotel room. That money is set aside and then goes to the city. In addition to that, there is this TBID fee that generates about, as I mentioned, 1.2, 1.4 million a year that goes directly to the hotels for marketing. And they market themselves. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of marketing going on right now. In addition, the Chamber of Commerce manages and provides administrative support to this business district on their behalf, and their charges are fairly significant to the tune of about $170,000 a year. So something your council may want to consider if you were to move forward with deferring the collection of the TOT. You may also want to allow the hotels the latitude to not pay into the marketing district, the tourism district, at their discretion at 6 of one, half dozen of the other. If they think that it's warranted to pay that money and continue to market, or if they think it would be better to defer that to help them out with the cash flow, I think that's something we should consider. And I'd also suggest considering formally requesting the chamber to either reduce or waive its administrative fees, as given there's not a whole lot of activity going on right now with respect to the hotels and not a whole lot of administrative work required. And that would provide some true immediate relief to the hotels directly, as opposed to deferring the collection from those that are visiting the hotels. So just some additional options and data for your council's consideration as you debate this matter.
Okay, before I make my comments, does anybody want to make a further comment? I agree with Mayor Pro Tem Wilk and Councilmember Silva that these are not even happening now. It isn't the deferral of anything. It's whatever. When the hotel rooms are empty, there is no TOT tax for anybody, ergo there's nothing to defer. And right now, I'm reluctant to add another even small burden on our cash flow. And I appreciate the city manager's suggestions that there are maybe other things that we can do that will share the burden and drop really to their bottom line and the hotel's bottom line. And so I agree that we should not take this up. As a result, however, of what the city manager discussed, I'm going to run a different question, I think, by the council, which is, do we want to look at any economic deferral or benefit for the hotels up to and including the bid numbers? So let's go through the list again. Let's start with Mayor Pro Tem Wilk.
Well, thank you, Mayor, and I appreciate the city manager's comments on there, because actually those are some ideas that would actually help the hotels. Right now, the deferment is a nicety that it doesn't mean the hotel is going to be collecting any more money or doing any more business or paying any less or more. In fact, potentially they could be using it for purposes that they really shouldn't be using it, which again is operational. But if it's administrative costs, if it's payments into some type of a business district, if there's other ways that they can actually truly be helped in reducing their obligations, that's something that can immediately benefit the hotels rather than a deferral of TOT, which they would be paying anyway. So I actually appreciate those comments, and I would support something like that.
Okay. Councilmember Riddell.
I think that I don't know exactly what question you're asking, but I think that we should be working with all business owners, whether it's the hotel, any sector within Walnut Creek, to try to figure out ways in order to assist them. If that means that we're, as it relates to this specific issue, if we're going to be deferring or coming up with some mechanism that they all work out amongst themselves, I'm all for that.
Okay. Councilmember Francois.
Lowering my hand. I appreciate the sentiments, and I think this was a good conversation. I appreciate the city manager's thoughts on this as well. I would like to see it focused on hotels, and if we can have an agenda item come forward in the future that looks at all of these things, waiving the T-bid, the chamber potentially agreeing to waive its administrative fee, and then picking up on Councilmember Silva's idea of are still collecting the TOT, but perhaps for a quarter or a month or whatever we decide, allocating that for a particular purpose that could help the hotels. I would like to see that come back as a future agenda item.
Thank you. Councilmember Silva.
I too appreciate the city manager's insights and thoughts. And I also just did a little back of the envelope. If we were to defer the first quarter's TOT, which would be January through March, it's due and payable in a week. If you defer the payment date 90 days, it means they would need to pay that money July 30th, which is barely out of this problem. So I think we make it worse for them, not better, by delaying their payments, because I think, as Mayor Pro Tem mentioned, they're going to end up using the TOT for operating expenses, and they will have no income in this period to actually pay what's due to us. So I would prefer our discussions to focus on how we can help them help themselves, whether it's to amend the T-bid for an emergency so that they can better use those dollars, or how we can, if we were going to how we can invest in the business recovery of the community, not just in hotels, because if we invest in the broader, we help everyone, not only the retail and the restaurant and the hotel sector.
Thank you. I agree with my council members, and I would like it brought back as a broader presentation to see what we can do. All right. Next on the agenda. Oh, no, the council has to vote to accept this. So can I see head nods? Does everybody accept this report? I see Matt, I see Justin, I see Cindy and Kevin. So thank you very much, all of you. And I also accept it. Now we're on to.
If I may, Mayor, quickly, sorry to interrupt, Dan Buckshire, City Manager. I couldn't see everybody's head nods on the prior. Is there a general consensus to bring an agenda item that more holistically looks at the TBID, the TOT, the chamber administrative fees, potential uses for TOT, to look not only for ways to help the hotel industry, but other businesses more broadly? Was there general consensus on that? I couldn't see.
It was unanimous.
Just to be clear, I'm okay with bringing that back an agenda item to discuss any topics that you work with the chamber and the TOT group and decide if there's any other ways that can be assisted either through that program or another. I'm not okay with, at least at this point, having a conversation on how we spend TOT dollars until we get subsequently to how do we fix the 2020 and 2021 budget problem that we're having. Otherwise, we're just going to be dealing with issues in two separate manners.
Okay, so I'm hearing that still gives us some right to discuss most of what was proposed. So, and I actually am going to say that I appreciate Council Members Waddell's opinion. I think that the other council members, and correct me if I'm wrong, raise your hand. I believe that we've agreed to discuss this as a whole issue, looking at ways to help spur and bring back the strength of our business community. So none of this is going to drain our efforts at all. Later on. Okay. Is that sufficient for you?
Yes, thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Now, next on the agenda is the consent calendar. Does any council member wish to pull the item? I'm looking for hands. I see no city things. Does any member of the public wish to comment on an item on the consent calendar? If you do, please use the raise hand feature, or if you're connected by audio only, press *9 if you would like to provide a public comment. At this time, I will ask the city clerk if there are any members of the public who are interested in making a comment.
We have no members of the public wanting to provide public comment on the consent calendar.
Thank you very much. That being the case, I will entertain a motion.
Move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
Okay.
With the changes we were given.
As amended, yes.
As amended.
Okay, may I have a roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Francois.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Wilk.
Aye.
Councilmember Silva.
Aye.
Councilmember Waddell.
Aye.
Mayor Haskew.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously.
All right, since we're on a roll, the next item on the agenda is public communications. This portion of the meeting is reserved for comment on items that are not on the agenda. Under the Brown Act, the council cannot act on items raised during public communications, but may respond briefly to statements made or questions posed, request clarification, or refer the item to staff. Does any member of the public wish to provide public comments at this time? Please use the raised hand feature or press *9 if you're connected by audio only. If you would like to provide public comment. At this time, I will ask the city clerk if there are members of the public who would like to make any comments.
We do have several members of the public wanting to provide comment.
Okay.
We will bring in Amanda Conrad.
May I have a moment, please? I'm reminding these people that they have 2 minutes to comment, and also that we ask, under the circumstances, that we remember that this is a public meeting and we're all here to serve the city, and we're asking for courteous language and understanding that we're all working under difficult times. Now, City Clerk, would you please invite people in?
We have Amanda Conrad.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Amanda Conrad. I'm a resident of Moraga, California, although I spend plenty of time in Walnut Creek. I'm also a part of East Bay Neighborhoods for Responsible Technology, Walnut Creek. My comment is the city of Walnut Creek approved 3 master license agreements on April 7th of 2020 without due process. Full citizen participation wasn't encouraged. The city was approached by Telecom over 2 years ago and decided not to notify citizens about this major infrastructure project. Ultimately, they chose to hold this meeting during a time when shelter-in-place restrictions were in place. These restrictions further diminished the ability to have an open forum, and many people were not even aware that the city would be having meetings under these restrictions. I feel that it's inappropriate and unconscionable that the city went ahead with this agreement during this time, and ask that you rescind the agreement and wait until citizens' questions can be fully addressed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. May I have the next speaker brought in?
Sure. This is user SMJ337A. Go ahead.
I don't know quite I'm having a little trouble with signing in. This is Pete Bennett. This is my office. I'm the guy that runs a blog that wants to help people called BayAreaHomeless.com. All the obstacles thrown against me over the last 10 years from when I spoke. Broken computers, broken nose, cracked ribs, concussions, and I'm still standing up to help. And I don't see anything warm and fuzzy coming out of this meeting. Sorry, but I'm a little bit jaded. I had 5 offices here in Walnut Creek, 5. All of them ended in regards to something else that's going on. And I came forward in something very important, and my life turned upside down. I've lost not just a few $100,000, but I had almost 600 domains, maybe more, I can't remember. They would have done about $1 million a month revenue. I was going to run it right here in Walnut Creek. Names that were elegant, semantically rich. And instead, I get concussions. Across the street, my head went through that window. Around the corner, I'm being beaten up in the middle of the street. I have a site about sightseeing that I'm developing, but I can't work anywhere. There's no library, and I don't want to go back there because somebody broke my ribs. Somebody tried to choke me to death. I know they're working on it, but it's taken a very long time. I spoke in front of this council in November 2011. That's the end.
Thank you. Next person, please.
Alice Lee. Alice Lee, go ahead.
Hear me? Okay. Oh, I see my children left this background. I apologize. I did not realize that they did that. Maybe I'll just take that off. Sorry. Alice Lee, Alamo, California. I'm part of East Bay Neighborhoods for Responsible Technology. I request that the council reverse their decision at the April 7, 2020 City Council meeting to approve the MLAs with AT&T, Verizon, and ExteNet. That decision should be delayed until the Ninth Circuit Court rules on the legality of the FCC order of 2018 to streamline approval of small cell antennas. The Ninth Circuit will decide whether or not the FCC order is overreaching in its limitation of local government authority, your authority. It makes sense that you wait for legal clarity on your authority before signing an agreement with these wireless entities. Waiting a couple more months for this clarity is a small amount of time compared to the 2 years of negotiating that has passed. A second request is to hold an in-person public meeting to inform and get public input. The more urgent situation with COVID-19 makes it impossible to have a proper public meeting on an issue which clearly affects many residents and workers of our city. The agenda report from the April 7 meeting states that each carrier expects to install over 100 antennas to cover the entire city, leading to, quote, a significant visual and maintenance impact, end quote. That's a total of 300 plus antennas affecting our community's aesthetic appeal, property values, and maintenance costs. It makes sense to invite public input on a large project with such effects. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there another speaker?
Yes. There are about 6 more in the queue. We're bringing in Craig Deviney.
Thank you.
Craig.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello? Hi, okay. Yeah, my name's Craig Deviney. I'm a citizen.
Can you speak a little louder?
Okay. Craig Deviney. I live in Walnut Creek, California with my family. I'm an emergency physician here at a local hospital, and I want to voice my protest in regards to how the communications was handled for the telecom companies to roll out their antennas without allowing the community input. We've known for a long time that the EMFs from the cell towers are dangerous, and the Telecom Act that was passed that allows these companies to roll out their infrastructure without any community input was based on outdated studies from radar in the 70s, and only responds to the actual heating of tissue and the damage caused by heating of tissue. It doesn't take into account any of the other the damage caused by the frequencies, such as damage to our DNA strands, cancer. It contributes to infertility. You may not be aware that your cell phone has a warning on it telling you not to hold it against your skin because of just even the thermal damage that occurs. These towers are much stronger than that, these 5G. We need to be able to have an opportunity to stand up to them. We need to have our voices heard in the community. And I'd like to hopefully that you will reconsider your stance on not hearing the community speak on this issue.
Thank you. I hear that as the end of your statement. Is there anyone else?
So, Baumsteiger Consulting.
Thank you.
Pleasant Hill resident. I just want to echo the same concerns as the rest of the people who have spoken up regarding the master license for the telecom carriers. It is concerning that the city of Walnut Creek has allowed installation of these antenna arrays and radios without prior to approving the master license, and doing this in a time of health concern, and approving this in on April 7th is absolutely unconscionable. Installation of these antenna arrays has yet to be proven as safe, and allowing these to be installed before actually approving the master license and getting input from the public is unacceptable. I can see the rest of my time.
Thank you very much for your comments. Is there another speaker?
Jillian Standish.
Thank you.
Jillian.
Yes.
Okay, you're on. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Jillian Standish, and I live here in Walnut Creek, and I'm also a member of the East Bay Neighborhoods for Responsible Technology. And I object that the city of Walnut Creek approved a master license agreement with 3 telecom carriers on April 7th, 2020, without what I feel was proper public participation. I do not feel the Walnut Creek residents were properly notified that this was going to happen, particularly when we are under shelter-in-place restrictions. I feel it is unethical that the city went ahead with approving this agreement during the scary time of COVID-19 crisis. I request that the MLA approved on April 7th be rescinded until the placement and impacts of these 5G cell towers on our community can be addressed when Walnut Creek residents and the City Council can work together by participating in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. Is there another speaker?
We have Sheila, user Sheila.
It's Sheila. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm also going to speak to the 5G issue. While other cities are holding off on unnecessary meetings, the city of Walnut Creek has chosen not to do that. And even though the telecom installations may arguably be considered a necessary service, voting on a master license agreement really isn't. This is all about interpretation, and it really does appear disingenuous to think that after 2 years of going back and forth on these MLAs, that suddenly during this COVID crisis, this agreement had to be voted on. I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to Mayor Pro Tem Wilk, who had the fortitude to provide a no vote on this issue, and to recommend that there be more time for review, which I think our community deserves. I also had sent an email earlier today, which I noticed has not been attached to the agenda. So I'm going to try to read a part of that until I run out of time, which I probably will. And my email that I sent that is not attached said, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council, is very disappointing that the City of Walnut Creek has chosen to move forward with the vote on an issue that so clearly deserves more attention. Due to the current shelter in place, the community has neither been able to meet amongst themselves or with council. And the people who live, work, eat, and play in Walnut Creek appreciate due process. Concerned citizens are respectfully requesting that the master license agreement be rescinded and that the city refrain from addressing permits and any new cell antennas until the shelter-in-place order has been lifted. Other Contra Costa cities have taken the time to involve their communities in this process, and I urge the city of Walnut Creek to do this. Please take appropriate action on behalf of your constituents who deserve transparency and accountability on this important issue. Thank you very much.
Sheila, may we have your last name and your city of residence?
Absolutely. My last name is Hill, and I live in Concord. But I shop and dine a lot in the city of Walnut Creek. I spend a lot of time there.
Good. Thank you. We appreciate it. Yes, thank you. All right.
And RJ?
In Walnut Creek. Can you hear me?
Yes. RJ, would you please give us your name and city of
John
residence?
Stevenson, Walnut Creek.
Thank you.
Walnut Creek is a beautiful city. Walnut Creek is, I was also shocked that the vote went ahead last meeting during the COVID shelter in place. Thank you, Mr. Wilk, for voting against. Walnut Creek is filled with beautiful homes, beautiful land, beautiful parks, history, beautiful people, and lots of beautiful, innocent children. Why would we want to install dozens upon dozens of ominous-looking antennas broadcasting carcinogenic radiation 24/7, 365? Wouldn't we want to put this off as long as is humanly possible to protect our children while we allow the public to have a voice and help empower our city council to protect and serve our community. Hundreds upon hundreds of world-class and world-renowned scientists, medical doctors, and health professionals have come together to sound the alarm that this technology has gotten out of control, is dangerous. Please look at the Bioinitiative report, the World Health Organization's classification of wireless radiation as a Class 2B carcinogen. The ehtrust.org, run by a Nobel Prize winning scientist, Doctors for Safe Technology, and countless other organizations, peer-reviewed data. I urge you to please use whatever tactics and legal avenues are at your disposal to rescind last week's vote to sign the master plans, the master agreements, and please put this off as long as you can while your community can become involved and have the voice, find a way to protect our children from this radiation. My conscience and your consciences cannot endure putting more of these antennas up now, knowing that the data is overwhelming and it's coming out daily. It's harming us and our children. Other cities in the area have strengthened their ordinances to keep these antennas out of the city, specifically out of residential neighborhoods. We can do the same. If your grandchildren look you in the face and ask you, what did you do when they were trying to put up these antennas? How are we going to tell them that we didn't do anything? We can't. I don't want to say that I did nothing. When was the last time you couldn't send an email or didn't have a cell to make a cell phone call, have enough signal? It hasn't happened. We don't need this technology urgently right now. So again, I urge you to please look at those studies.
Thank you. Another speaker, please.
Matt Lewis.
I'm part of the East Bay Neighborhood for Responsible Technology. On April 7, 2020, the City Council moved to approve allowing the city manager to sign 3 separate master license agreements. These MLAs are the rules that dictate all installation of 5G equipment in Walnut Creek. Included in typical MLAs are how far they are from schools, hospitals, and residents, notification to surrounding residents, proof of NEPA review, least intrusive methods, ADA, requirements, disfavorable versus favorable locations, general liability insurance provisions, annual recertification, RF testing and monitoring, aesthetics, underground and undergrounding. All of these were either lacking or completely missing from the MLAs, and none of these are included in the city's wireless ordinance. Why? In addition, the city can regulate operations of the wireless equipment, and just relinquishing that power to the federal standards is not good enough, as the standards are outdated for this new technology. The MLAs does not add any additional operating requirements, and it should. You have an obligation to take a closer look and understand the implications of just referring to these federal standards. In addition, you should make a concerted effort to educate all aspects of this new technology and obtain feedback from your constituents, which according to the organizational profile of the city you report to, who send their children to Walnut Creek schools and spends money in the local businesses. None of this you did. In addition, the city manager mentioned some principles during the COVID crisis earlier in this meeting. I have to say that this vote that you made last do not stand up against these principles, particularly the one that says make decisions that will hurt us in the long run. The decision you made last meeting definitely will. I thank you for your time. And also thank you to Mayor Pro Tem for voting no last week. Thank you. Or last meeting.
Thank you. We understood. Next speaker, please.
Susan Junefish.
Hi, my name is Susan Jenfish. Could everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I work as the Director of Parents for a Safer Environment, servicing primarily the community of Contra Costa County. Our membership, now numbering over 2,000 individuals from the East Bay alone, includes at least 370 Walnut Creek and Rossmore residents. We are partnering with East Bay Neighbors for Responsible Technology. My formal training is from UC Berkeley with an advanced degree in public health. So over the past 18 years, our organization has affected policy change in local state agencies and have been recognized by the California Public Health Department and the state legislature. And we've even had the privilege of working with the city of Walnut Creek several years ago to inform and encourage the city to implement protective policies for pest control and pesticide usage issues. I submitted a written public comment with a list of references earlier today from peer-reviewed and published research linking chronic or long-term damages to children from non-ionizing radiation at the levels they receive currently from wireless technology. We expect much higher exposure to children and the fetus from 5G installations, which residents will have no control to turn off. It's so important that, and critical, in particular for children, to have a respite from the oxidative stress that is caused by exposure to non-ionizing radiation throughout the day. With 5G, residents will lose that ability, lower their exposure, and allow their bodies to repair. So I wanted to just quickly, in a nutshell, state that scientists from 42 countries, including those from the United States, submitted an open letter to governments to heed the research showing the emerging health problems associated with wireless radiation. And so one of the World Health Organization, International Agency for Research on Cancer, scientists have stated, many scientists worldwide now believe that radio frequency radiation should be elevated to a class 1 human carcinogen on the same list as cigarettes, x-rays, and asbestos. And experts have advised that increased healthcare costs can be avoided if governments take heed of this concern and curtail the proliferation of 5G technology. So I trust that each of you will be welcoming scientific findings from sources that are not funded by the telecommunications industry, thus considered biased. And we are really fortunate to have close access to experts from our local UC Berkeley, UCSF, and Stanford University.
Thank you. I'm going to take a moment here to reaffirm that all written documents that are related to this meeting will be saved as part of the archived version of this meeting and will be available to the public if necessary. And now, are there any more speakers?
We have about 5 more speakers and 3 written comments to read into the record. We're bringing in Jody Nelson.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so I wanted to say that Dan Bushke relayed at the beginning of this meeting that during the COVID crisis, the county is being very accessible and accommodating and really listening to us, the city of Walnut Creek. I want you to consider how important this is to all of us. With that said, I wanted to take an opportunity to thank Mayor Pro Tem Kevin Wilk for having the foresight to vote to delay the MLA. And you have had 2 years to evaluate this MLA and the wireless code, and you approved it on 4/7. Other cities around the Bay Area have reached out to their citizens to collaborate with them. Why? You chose not to. Why? Other cities have made the decision to obtain outside counsel, as this is a very specialized area of law. I personally forwarded you the name of a local telecom attorney with over 25 years experience in telecom law. She relayed that she would be willing to give the city a 1-hour free consultation. She could have helped the city with both the wireless ordinance and the MLA, giving the city an advantage of having a strong wireless ordinance, but you chose not to reach out to her. Why? Then, during a worldwide pandemic and shutdown, you made a decision that these agreements had to be voted on immediately, or you would lose leverage with telecom. You argued that the stimulus package could introduce laws that undermine your ability to negotiate. This is faulty thinking. Case in point, Walnut Creek Council relayed that telecom could bring in their own poles if the city delayed their vote. But bringing in their own poles for 5G infrastructure is exactly what they don't want to do, which is why they've commandeered the public right-of-ways. It would be extremely expensive to place their poles on poles for the dense population of 5G. Other cities understand the need to invite the public, giving the community the opportunity to ask questions, helping them to understand, providing them with transparency, accountability, and collaboration. They have also worked with their cities and figured out how to build strong MLAs and ordinances, proving it can be done. The wireless ordinance and the MLA for the city of Walnut Creek could have been so much more. And I ask that you rescind your 4-7 vote regarding the approval to allow the city manager to sign these agreements and bring the public in so we can become fully informed about this massive.
Thank you. Another speaker, please. Yeah, Susie, we can't hear you.
Bringing in user D. Lee. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
please.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm DJ Lee. I've lived in Walnut Creek for over 10 years. Want to just briefly talk about some facts and importance of research with respect to your recent approval of the master licenses of 5G cells last week. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, is the specialized cancer agency of the World Health Organization, WHO. One of the agents they list as a class 2B carcinogen is radio frequency electromagnetic fields, which includes Wi-Fi radiation, 3G and 4G, and especially 5G. I want to say a thank you to Susan Junfish earlier for the update that some scientists are recommending actually a class 1 carcinogen, very deadly, but 2B isn't totally innocent either. Note that other substances also classified as 2B carcinogens include lead, chloroform, talc powder, gasoline, and engine exhaust. I appreciate Mr. Dan Bookshie's earlier listing protecting public health as a priority number 1. And in line with this priority, I would at the very least pause at the notion of releasing something as possibly toxic as lead or chloroform into the air everywhere I live. I ask you, what are we not able to do now that with what we currently have? Are we not able to care for and connect with our loved ones and our colleagues or conduct online courses without 5G? If we are able, then what is the huge rush in rolling out 5G right now? If not, then what specifically do you and the people of Walnut Creek need right now that only 5G will give you? I haven't seen yet research from the city, but the time that we can get from not rushing is something we can use to do and transparently communicate to our residents responsible, thorough, and unbiased, meaning not from Verizon or contractors, research in the interest of making data-driven decisions to protect and assure our residents and community. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another speaker?
Bringing in Carolina Park.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Carolina Park. I'm a citizen and resident of Martinez. I'm also a mother. I do business in Walnut Creek. My daughter goes to art class there, so I'm really concerned regarding the 5G installation. And I just want to add that I see the Walnut City Council is really concerned about all the citizens' health, especially during this time. So I'm really shocked that 5G antennas were approved, because I want to just say it in a quick, 5G adds to existing wireless radiation and increased risk of cancer, cellular stress, genetic damage, structural and functional changes of the reproductive system, learning and memory deficits, neurological disorders, and it negatively impacts general well-being in humans. So if those antennas will be installed in Walnut Creek, I'll probably not bring my daughter to the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Shirley Zelengoski.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, on behalf of Parents for a Safer Environment and East Bay Neighborhood for Responsible Technologies, I'd like to sincerely thank you for your service to the city of Walnut Creek. You are aware that you have the responsibility for the welfare of all citizens in Walnut Creek, and my public comment tonight involves the health of the community members in reference to your approval of the 5G towers. You approved a master license agreement with 3 telecom carriers on April 7th. I would like to inquire as to what measures you took to inform the community. Due to the current stay-at-home orders, I do not feel that the community was adequately allowed an opportunity to speak out either for or against this issue. You are the representatives, but must always keep in mind the ramifications of the actions you take on behalf of the citizens. You made an economic decision that will profit the business community, but I'm asking you to look at the risk. At the current time, most people have had major adjustments, and this decision was probably not weighing heavily on their minds. I feel it would be much more appropriate to wait until a time that the citizens have returned to a normal lifestyle, when a FaceTime with community members could be held. The health risk to them is of major importance, and their voice is ultimately a deciding factor. Scientists have warned of health hazards such as brain tumors, cancer, and autoimmune conditions with repetitive exposure to the electromagnetic fields. I'm respectfully requesting that you rescind your April 7th decision until you can better gauge the will of the people. And I'm asking you to agendize this for a future meeting when it has been lifted. The towers will be unsightly due to their frequency because there has to be so many of them, but that's not nearly as problematic as the ensuing health conditions that will materialize. And that should be your primary concern. People's lives are at risk under COVID-19 because it's an acute crisis, but I feel that this issue should be treated equally as a risk in a long-term crisis matter. So it's a very serious matter, and I definitely want the panel to bring experts to the City Council with community members present. Thank you for your attention, and please agendize it.
Thank you.
We're bringing in Ton Hall.
Thank you.
Hello, city members. My name is Ton Hall, and I am the loving mother of my beautiful African-American son, Miles Hall, who was murdered by the Walnut Creek police officer.
Todd, may I ask you to speak closer to your mic? I can barely hear you.
Can't hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, council members. My name is Ton Hall. I'm the loving mother of my beautiful African-American son, Miles Hall, who was murdered by the Walnut Creek police officers on June 2nd. Miles was 23 years old, was bright and beautiful, and not a criminal. We raised our son where he went to elementary, middle, high school until he was stolen by the agency that was supposed to protect and serve. We made sure that the police knew who Miles was because we understand that Black men and those who have mental illness are much more likely to be killed by police. Our family took so many efforts to ensure Miles' safety. On Sunday, another Black male, Stephen Taylor, was killed by the San Leandro police while having a mental health crisis at Walmart. Stephen's killing is another example why we need a non-police response to the mentally ill. Stephen Taylor's killing brings up why our family and FOSATH, Friends of Ton, Alexis, and Scott Hall, want to make change and protect other families in this type of tragedy. We ask you lead and make changes here in Walnut Creek that can be modeled around the nation. We demand the following. Police don't show up to mental health crisis calls. There are better alternatives being used in different parts of the nation. Oregon has Cahoots, a non-police response. Policy changes, restrictive use of force. Why wasn't a taser used on Miles? Training, diversity, implicit bias, de-escalation, and crisis intervention. This could have saved Miles and Stephen Taylor and San Leandro. We ask for accountability, an independent investigation, citizen oversight committee. City leaders, we need you to be the change. I ask you to please go to justiceformileshall.org where you can see the video and see how Miles was brutally murdered on June 2nd by the Walnut Creek Police Department. Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Bringing in user Jennifer.
Hello?
There's something going wrong.
Yes, my son Luke would like to speak.
You have a TV on possibly in the background that you could.
There you go. Here, right here. There you go. You speak. You have a chance.
Hi, my name is Luke, and I am 8 years old, and I live in Walnut Creek. I know these antennas will make some people a lot of money, but can you be 100% sure that what comes out of these 5G antennas won't hurt me and everyone I know. And what about all the wildlife that lives here? Like all the wildlife. We're only a percentage of all the wildlife that lives here. But what about them? I hope you'll think about this.
Thank you. May I hear your voice, your name again, please?
Oh, and your name? Here.
Luke.
Davini.
Davini.
Thank you, Luke. I appreciate your comments.
You're welcome.
Are you done?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, next speaker.
Okay, I'm going to start reading the written comments that we have received.
Okay, you have an echo now, Susie.
Let me try that again. Okay. This comment is from Jennifer Davini. To those elected by us and now empowered to represent its citizens, the evidence is out there that there are negative health effects beyond that of thermal effects, and the greatest impact will be felt by our children and theirs. How can a people's elected leaders in good conscience proceed with implementing an even more contaminating technology than the 4G technology already proven to have a carcinogenic effect? And if there's any uncertainty in your minds, how can you, in good conscience, allow citizens to be guinea pigs for what 5G promises to emit? There is no way on earth you would contemplate such a risky gamble on our health, if not for the money, which can paralyze one's integrity. On behalf of every citizen, including you and your families, I implore you to look at the data that has only been suppressed and minimized by the industry who stands to gain everything. Let's not repeat history and make a mistake which will likely handicap and claim numerous innocent lives, as did the tobacco industry, just so you can look back years from now and say, should have, would have, could have. We build our lasting legacy on the decisions we make today. Stop the nonsense of 5G and put people before pockets. Sincerely, Jennifer Davini, resident of Walnut Creek. We have...
Would you, Susie?
Yes.
Would you please check to see whether any of the written comments are in addition to people who have already spoken? If you can do that.
Okay. The next written comment is from Karen Perkins, who I do not believe we heard from tonight.
Thank you.
Good evening, Council. It has come to my attention that the City of Walnut Creek has voted to move forward with a master license agreement during this shutdown for the future installation of 5G cell coverage. There are many independent studies on the negative health effects of 5G radiation, which is exponentially higher than 4G. There is no safe level of radiation. You may remember that when a 4G cell antenna was planned for parochial school roof in Lafayette, parents got together and protested, resulting in the antenna not being installed. These so-called 5G small cell antennas are not small and must be placed in close proximity to the user to be effective. This is virtually in front of everyone's house or business. While negative health effects are obviously more important, it is aesthetically ugly. The incredible project and expense it will be to install these towers has been communicated to you by others. It would also be very expensive to have to remove these antennas once installed. Other cities have had to remove them, and some cities will not be installing them. Nevertheless, it is not transparent during a shutdown to allow the city manager to sign 3 MLA master license agreements with 3 carriers. This was after pleas from citizens requesting that they postpone this meeting and all unnecessary meetings until after shelter in place was lifted. The community affected should be made fully aware about this involved and costly project, and certainly have an opportunity to participate in a robust discussion on it. As citizens of Walnut Creek, we comprise the tax-paying constituents and should have input other than 2 or 3 minutes during a video conference. I request that the city's actions on 4.7 regarding the MLA agreement be rescinded and the city refrain from addressing permits on any new cell antennas until the COVID-19 threat has been completed. That was from Karen Perkins. We have received a written comment from Susan Junefish, who also provided live public comments. And then we have another written comment received from Shirley Shellingoski, who also provided a live comment.
Thank you. And as I said before, the written comments will be attached to the record. Initially, I was going to suggest that we complete item 4, but public comment went on a bit longer than I expected. And I'm thinking that maybe the council is open to a 10-minute break. So I'm going to, no, I don't see any no's. I see yeses. So we're taking a 10-minute break and we will come back and start with item 4. Thank you very much. See you soon.
I'll ask them to change it.
Welcome back to the Tuesday, April 21st regular meeting of the Walnut Creek City Council. The next item on the agenda, item number 4, is council member and staff announcements and reports on activities or requests. Are there any closed session announcements?
Madam Mayor, there were no reportable actions from closed session this evening.
Thank you. City Manager, is there anything more you'd like to share?
Nothing at this time.
Thank you. Justin, you're the first picture that showed up on my screen, so may I ask you to do your report?
Nothing to report.
Thank you. Councilmember Matt Francois.
Thank you, Mayor. Yesterday, I attended virtually the board meeting of the DRAA along with Arts and Recreation Director Kevin Safine. And the board is a dynamic, great group of people that help put on a lot of great programs at the Lesher Center. And they are doing a lot of deep thinking and creative thinking about how to survive and thrive in the era of COVID-19, and particularly hard hit will be right now as a Lesher Center because it's closed, but going forward with various different types of social distancing requirements, and as those evolve, trying to adapt and overcome to those. So there was a lot of creative discussion about the potential for streaming productions if that becomes necessary, and also looking for outdoor venues for productions. And that was essentially the highlight. Those conversations are still in place. They were very appreciative of the partnership with the city and the collaboration that's going on there with Walnut Creek Downtown and the Chamber on economic development for the larger area, including the Lesher, which is such a great anchor. And if Mr. Safine is on the line, I did want to see if he could do a quick plug on the online recreation programming that's being done by the Arts and Rec Department. But if not, I will do that. And our great Arts and Rec Department.
Oh, he is here?
Yes.
Cool.
Where'd he go? Kevin, can you hear us?
Can you hear me, Susie?
There we go.
I can hear you, but it says you cannot start your video because the host has disabled it.
You're on. We can hear you.
Okay, I'll just speak if you can't see the video. Just says it's disabled. So thank you, Matt. You're asking about online virtual classes. Is that right?
Yes, please.
So we have piloted, if you can believe it, 60 online classes already. They started this week. We have had, this is mostly through the community arts program. So they run the gamut from visual arts to music to yoga, all online. They started this week. We have so far out of 4 days worth of registration, over 100 students signed up, $4,000 worth of revenue, and very happy instructors because it keeps them busy and employed. So I'm super excited about that. If people want more info, communityarts.org, one word, communityarts.org, where you can sign up and hopefully participate. So thank you for the question. More to come for sure.
Thanks, Kevin. That's my report, Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Kevin Safine. Thank you. Let's see, Councilmember Silva.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And thank you, Director Safine, for your report on what's happening online. It's also happening with some of our nonprofits who are in the performance arena, such as Diablo Ballet. And what happens with these online or virtual classes is you don't have to be in Walnut Creek to take them. My granddaughter, who is 4.5, suddenly had no ballet in Seattle, her new hometown, and they didn't really know what to do. And I signed Adelaide up for classes with Diablo Ballet in ballet. And she is very excited because she gets to do ballet still. So from 1,000 miles away. Last week, I attended the virtual board meeting of Walnut Creek Downtown, representing the city council as liaison. And also there was city manager Buckshire and assistant city manager Terry Kilgore. And thank you for their updates that they provided. It was an exceptional discussion amongst the board members about the COVID-19 and what it's doing to business and how businesses are responding and reacting. And I think we have a lot of opportunity to work with them going forward. There have been 2 council subcommittee meetings since we last met, both the finance committee and then the subcommittee that was working on the tenanting of the former Tender Green space in the Locust Street garage. And the results of those two committees are either here tonight or during closed session. On Thursday, I will be attending virtually a board meeting for the League of California Cities. It will be our first virtual board meeting of a board that has about 60 members, so that should be interesting. Rather than do it over a day and a half period, we're going to do it in 3 hours. We will be focusing on what's happening in our 5 strategic priority areas, which is housing, homelessness, public safety, emergency and wildfires, and fiscal stability. And on that note, we have done, the League has done a survey across cities to see the fiscal impacts of the COVID-19 and has some interesting data. But we also know, and we've been working with the National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, as well as the Counties Association in the nation, to lobby the federal government for the most recent subsequent stimulus bill to have it include local government entities. What happened with the CARES Act that was adopted, the $2 trillion stimulus package, is there were portions of the money that was allocated to each of the 50 states on a proportionate basis. So California was getting the largest amount, but a certain portion of that was to be allocated also to cities and counties, to local government based on population. But the population, you had to have a population greater than 500,000. We only have 6 cities in the state of California that have a population greater than 500,000, and only 18 of our 58 counties actually qualified for money in the stimulus package as well. So there has been an extensive lobbying effort with the federal government to try to secure funding for local governments of a smaller size, such as Walnut Creek, or even smaller. And we were not successful with the package that was approved and adopted by Congress today, but it appears that the federal government, particularly we have our congressional representatives here from California, as well as the Trump administration, are open to assisting local government, because after all, we are taking also great losses of revenues because of the losses of sales tax and the future impacts on property tax. 2 other things that I would mention: yesterday and today, we had kickoff meetings related to Community Service Day. About 30 people attended virtually over the course of the 2 meetings, and we had some very robust discussion, not only on how Community Service Day will work in October with social distancing requirements, but also about what volunteerism might be needed once the stay-at-home orders are lifted, how many weeds are growing in parks and gardens that are going to need to be pulled all at the same time on a same weekend. So it was enlightening and helpful. And Community Service Day has also sent 2 emails to its cadre of emails, which is about 3,700 community members, offering different ways to help during the shelter-in-place COVID requirements. And finally, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to give you an update on the census locally. City Manager Buckshire mentioned it previously. Currently, the national response rate is at 51%. The state of California is at 52%. And good news, Walnut Creek is at 65.7%. Oops, I didn't. No, come back. Let's see if it will come back this way. Nope. Okay, we're at 65.7%. But across the city, that percentage actually ranges from 50% to, in Kevin's neighborhood, it's almost at 80%. So we have a 30 percentage point range in response rates. And so we are working as a committee and with the county to try to get that percentage up. The lower responses are actually exactly where we thought they would be, which is in our multifamily neighborhoods that stretch from the base of the Iron Horse Trail at Red Gear and run up to Ignacio Valley Road and actually all the way to Bancroft. And so we have a committee of people that have been getting posters out into multifamily apartment complexes and putting them up around town. And we are also looking at how we can assist the county and the census effort in basically getting into the assisted living facilities and the board and care facilities, which is very important because there's a large amount of senior population that is in there in those group quarters. And that is my report. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mayor Pro Tem Wilk, would you now share?
There we go. Thank you. So I did attend the virtual board meeting for the County Connection, and the report from there is that we're about 80% down in ridership for County Connection as a whole. Bus operator shields have been installed now on 80 buses, and this will continue until the entire fleet is completed, which should be in the next few weeks. Things are stabilized currently in terms of how many drivers are taking time off. Right now, it's still about 80 or so drivers that have called in sick. Operators are all in full protective gear. There's still only one driver that's actually tested positive to date, but the others are concerned, certainly. As the mayor mentioned last week, entry is in the back of the bus, and I did want to confirm that, unless there's any kind of disability that would not allow them to be able to get up the steps. Then they would be able to enter from the front. County Connection's not collecting any fares this time, not through the Clipper card or through cash. And they're not billing Walnut Creek for the fares on routes 4, 5, and 7. And that will be during the COVID crisis. And I'll get more updates every meeting, and we'll see when this also opens up. That's my report.
Thank you very much. So as I said, for me, last time I have been appointed to the Innovate 680 Policy Advisory Committee, and we had our first quarterly meeting. We learned about the plan. Actually, for me, it was a review, and then what our job would be in how it works together in making things come out right. I also attended the East Bay Leadership Transportation Committee and heard from all of the bus people. Contra Costa Transportation Authority did have a representative, and we essentially commiserated with each other about, Bart was there too, the drop in use of the public transportation, understandably because of the shelter in place, and how that has had a significant impact on their operating income and concerns about how much of their workforce they can keep in place, et cetera. Then right after that, the city manager and I and Justin Waddell and Mayor Pro Tem Wilk attended a Chamber of Commerce virtual meeting, and we presented the city's concerns and actions. And then the real star of the show was the SBA representative. Unfortunately, by the time they heard from the SBA representative, pretty much all the money was gone, but they know how to do it better with the new approved federal law. And then I attended the CCTA meeting, Contra Costa Transportation Authority, and we made our usual improvements of changes in completions and things like that. But I'm very happy to report that there was a report on the project I-680 improvements, and as luck would have it, because there is no traffic, they have been able to do an amazing amount of work in a much shorter time. And instead of it's being completed in December of 2021, they think that it's really good chance that it will be completed by the end of this year at a savings to the whole cost of the project of approximately $1 million, and a lot more happy drivers because it will be finished, and hopefully we will have places to drive to by then. That is the end of my report, and we're now on to the next consideration item, the fiscal year 2020 budget update. At this moment, I invite staff to provide your presentation, and then we will proceed. Thank you very much, staff.
Yeah, Dan Buckshire, City Manager. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to kick this off, and then also Assistant City Manager Terry Kilgore, Kirsten Lacassie, our relatively new Administrative Services Director, and Katie Bruner, our Budget Manager, are going to run through the details here. And I do want to highlight that while it seems like quite some time, because Corona time is a bit warped, that Kirsten just joined us in January and Katie moved into her new role in January. And I do want to highlight that they have jumped into the deep end of the pool and are doing a tremendous job, especially for being so new to these roles. So it's very nice to have them here to help us with this presentation tonight. So, you know, what you're going to see here, to state the obvious, is that our financial picture has changed dramatically over the last 6 weeks. While we do a very nice job of projecting out 10-year trends through long-term financial forecasts, those prior forecasts are no longer relevant. Even though we did build in recession scenarios, we did not build in a global pandemic scenario. So this is far worse than anything that would have been projected. And that, you know, does highlight some of the challenges and potential pitfalls to assuming that long-term forecasts are truly accurate, because they really do just display trends as opposed to truly predicting what's going to happen in the future. And we will be speaking to that in more detail. We have been working, staff has been spending a tremendous amount of time working to gather information in order to try to present our best estimate of what our current situation looks like, as well as to try to forecast the future. And I will highlight there are many staff that have been working 7 days a week since this crisis broke out, and our budget and finance team are one of those in trying to gather this information. You know, trying to predict the future is always a difficult business, but it is even more so in this current environment. That said, I do know that there is one thing that I can say with 100% certainty, is that the forecasts and projections we have tonight will be wrong. There is no doubt about that. We hope they're not too far off, but they are really intended to provide some guidance and really share with you our thinking of how we came up with these estimates and numbers, to share the assumptions so that we can at least be working from the same base, recognizing there will be some variability. And we just don't know how much variability. I'd like to say that it's relatively small, but I don't have that much confidence in this point in time because the situation is so fluid. What we have been doing, as I mentioned, is providing a 10-year long-term financial forecast that is a best practice and overall is a good practice. But at this point, we are really zeroing in on the next 3 years, the next 1 to 3 years, because things have shifted so much. That is our newer time horizon, with an eye beyond that, recognizing what we do will have longer term implications, but trying to project beyond that time now is just extremely difficult. One thing that I think we can feel very good about is that while we do have challenges, and we will have challenges, we are well positioned to deal with them. I believe the years of fiscal discipline and planning that have been put in place by the council, current council, prior councils, and current and prior staff are paying off. You know, Warren Buffett has a quote that some of you have heard me share that is very fitting, is that when the tide goes out, you find out who's not wearing a swimsuit. And I'm pleased to report that Walnut Creek, we are well clothed at the moment, and we'll be in, better shape than many, and that will really help us going forward. So one of the keys that we are trying to strive as we work through this, that I'd really like to emphasize with the council as well, is that going forward, we want to make sure we do not underreact and kick the can down the road. Conversely, we don't want to overreact and make decisions that may prove to be short-sighted down the road. So what we're really trying to do is find that sweet spot, if you will, of addressing the short-term crisis and keeping our eye on the long term, so that we are well positioned. And with that, I will hand it over to Terry to roll into the details.
Thank you, Dan. I thought what you were going to say with 100% certainty is that even though we've only been dealing with COVID for coming up on a couple months now, it feels like we are drastically behind in being ready to move forward with a 20 or a 21 budget because we don't have answers. But what I can tell you from talking to my peers in other cities is that we are actually ahead of the curve by leaps and bounds. Because we had been doing financial forecasting, because as Dan mentioned, this council and previous councils have had the foresight to do strategic financial planning. We actually are well positioned. We can get you good guesses where other people are just realizing that they need to figure out up from down. So that is a kudo to those who came before us. So this evening, what we're hoping to accomplish is one, to bring you up to speed on what we do know and what we don't know, and then give you the opportunity to provide some feedback on what we've shared with you, as well as the overall budget balancing strategies that we shared with the Finance Committee to make sure that we all understand both the decisions ahead of us and sort of the guardrails that we've put up around the process. Next slide, please. So we've broken the discussion into 4 chunks just to make it feel a little bit more wielding. The first, we're going to talk about timeline. That's obviously shifted from where we thought we were when we came to you with the 18-month updates, or just in early March. We're going to talk about some of the existing policies that already are in place that can help us in our decision making. We'll share with you some detailed numbers as best as we can project them at the moment and what our updated financial outlook is trending towards. And then we'll come back to the budget strategies. I'll kind of give you the spoiler alert. We're projecting deficits like pretty much every other city in the nation. And so these budget strategies will inform how we go about addressing those deficits and what to do next. Next, please. So the timeline, we've had to adjust to reflect the COVID crisis. On the left-hand side of your screen where it says pre-COVID-19 in the blue colors, we thought we were on a good track. We were using the general long-term financial forecast that had been adopted by Council in 2019. We were updating it with new data. We were getting better than expected sales tax returns, better than expected property tax returns. And we were actually getting ready to bring you an updated outlook. And we shared a little bit of it, the 18-month on March 5th, that we were projecting a 3-month surplus. We were also projecting better numbers in the out years, fiscal 21, 22, and 23. Then came COVID. And the world shifted. So as we talked about in the earlier COVID update presentation, the shelter in place has had some dramatic impacts on our revenues, and we'll go through each revenue stream with you in a little more detail later so that you can see how we've adjusted our projections and get your reaction. But we have been busy figuring out what this looks like. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we are projecting deficits for fiscal year 20 as well as for the upcoming years. Next slide, please. So you'll see here that we are breaking out very consciously a distinction between our timeline for fiscal year 20 and our fiscal year 21 process. And that is intentional because we feel that we have better information on 20, and we also have a shorter window in which to react and need to make some pressing decisions. So we're putting 20 on the front burner. This coming Friday, we'll be coming to Finance Committee with more details on the projected deficits and how we're going to propose balancing the budget. April 21st, we're coming to Council with that same information. April 24th, we're coming to you with some proposed reductions. And then May 5th, we'll be bringing those proposed reductions to Council for adoption, hopefully. So we will have by May 5th a plan on how we're going to adjust the fiscal year 20 budget to deal with the projected deficit. Next slide, please. So for fiscal year 21, that begins May 7th in earnest. Obviously, during the fiscal year 20 time, we'll be talking about some of our assumptions in how we think we'll rebound eventually over time from this recession. But 21, we've got a little more time. And so we'll be coming back May 7th with a more in-depth budget study session with the Finance Committee on May 7th. May 19th, we'll be coming to council with proposed reductions. June 2nd, introduction of the 21 budget, and then a June 16th adoption. The caveat here is that we may need an additional Finance Committee meeting here or there, depending on the feedback that we get. But we've at least got these dates on the calendar and ready to proceed with. So that you'll see in our presentation here, fiscal year 20 is green, fiscal year 21 is purple, just to help us keep the 2 years straight. We were finding even with staff, we were getting confused about which budget we were talking about. So that color coding is intentional. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, this isn't our first rodeo. We've been through recessions, though never one quite of this magnitude. The scale and specifics of this crisis are very unique, but I think we can lean very heavily on the good thinking that's been done in the past. And to serve as a reminder of these guideposts, we're going to walk through them just really quickly. On the budget goals, obviously our focus is maintaining the city's mission, vision, and values while building a comprehensive financial plan. We want to balance the need to provide high quality programs and services to our community while keeping in mind our fiscal health. And it really is a balancing act. And our budget goals talk about striking a balance between these two very important goals. Next slide, please. Our budget development policies, obviously we need to be in bounds with all legal requirements, which means we have to bring forward a balanced budget. And as we build the budget, we will be keeping the city council priorities in mind, as well as the mission, vision, values. While we build the budget, we are looking both at the short-term gaps as well as the longer-term gaps out on the horizon. As Dan mentioned, we're kind of bringing in our focus to a 2 to 5 year horizon just to get us through this crisis, because anything past 5 years right now is just complete guessing. And some would even say more than a year or two out is guessing as well, not knowing what's going to happen with our economic winds. And then the last bullet I want to highlight for you is minimizing the impact to the community and to city employees. This one's just a good reminder that we have multiple stakeholders and multiple groups whose needs we're trying to balance as we go through this process. Next slide, please. Our financial planning policies are near and dear, obviously, to our finance team and to my heart. And I believe this first one is critical, which is it is good financial practice to use one-time monies, one-time income for one-time expenses. As we talked about earlier, a lot of cities have gotten themselves in trouble paying for ongoing expenses with one-time monies. And so we are keeping a close eye on that. Sort of a corollary to that point is making sure that we're not getting too reliant on those one-time monies or those unreliable revenues that pop in and out of our budget just based on the nature of our business. And that this last point is that we did in these policies contemplate that during budgetary contractions, of which this obviously qualifies, it is appropriate to use reserves at the council's discretion to ease that transition as we reorganize our operations, our services, and our staffing. So because we've done well in saving up for a rainy day, it gives you all more room to make decisions as we flow through this crisis. Next slide, please. So obviously we need to also comply with our city policies. We've got detailed policies on how to use one-time revenues, how to use our general fund surpluses, our fund balance policies, and then how we also establish classifications of funds. And then the last point here is that the city does have the ability to consider judicious use of debt financing, but we've been pretty specific about only using that for one-time capital projects, not to finance ongoing operations. Next slide, please. So Dan went through most of the principles. So we're gonna breeze past these, but I just wanted to highlight that pursuing options that get us through the crisis in the near term is important, but it's also important to keep an eye to the long term. We want to make sure we're finding that balance between how to float through the crisis, but also dealing with those forces we've talked about in the past of increasing pension costs in the out years, as well as just our changing financial structure. One principle I wanted to highlight for you that Dan mentioned briefly is that we're not going to have perfect information as we go through this, but unfortunately, we're all still going to be asked to make some difficult decisions. And so keeping in mind that everybody's just doing the best we can with the information that we have is going to be critical. Next slide. So as we move into the updated financial outlook, the situation, we talked a little bit again at the COVID update, is the majority of our retailers are closed or greatly reduced in their operations. Restaurant revenues, we are projecting to be down quite significantly. Our hotels are open, but they have seen a dramatic decrease in occupancy. The sales tax deferment for small businesses is a great way to show support for our businesses, but it is going to do some impact on our financials. When it comes to city services that are revenue generating, we talked about the closure of the Leisure Center. Kirsten will give you more details on that in a moment, but we have presumed that it stays closed at least through May 3rd, and in one scenario all the way through June 30. And that is the same situation for our arts and recreation classes and programs. A small glimmer of hope, as Dan mentioned before, our development review processes are still underway. We're still getting quite a bit of interest from the development community who see this as an opportunity to use this lag time to get through their entitlement processes and work on their building permit process. And then construction does continue on a handful of projects. Affordable housing has an exemption under the existing orders. So we have a handful of affordable housing projects that are continuing, as well as some wrap-up construction to make sure our sites are safe. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten Lacasse, our Administrative Services Director, to talk you through some more detail on our financial trends. Kirsten.
Thank you, Terry. I'm Kirsten Lacasse, Administrative Services Director. I'm going to walk you through our financial trend analysis assumptions and 2 scenarios that we've been working on based on the shelter-in-place orders. So the financial trend analysis essentially is using the base of the long-term financial forecast to allow us to look at the trends in a much shorter time frame. So and help inform our budget decisions over the next 2 to 5 years. It incorporates the most recent economic and financial data available. And so with that, we've created 2 scenarios. We are calling them scenario A and B. Scenario A assumes that the shelter-in-place order is lifted on May 3rd. Scenario B assumes it's lifted on June 30th. And I'll get into some more detail on those scenarios up further in the presentation. So again, as Terry and Dan both mentioned previously, all these numbers are estimates, and we're using them to illustrate trends, but things are changing constantly, so these numbers may change as well. In these scenarios that we'll go through, the reserves remain fully funded per the current council policies. So we are not using any reserves in these scenarios to close any gaps. Additionally, we are not including any proposed budget balancing strategies in these gaps. In these scenarios. So this is our long-term financial forecast that you saw back in April of 2019. And this is to give you some context of where we were then versus where we are now. We were forecasting moderate recessions in fiscal year 21 and 28. We also had included a 2.6% CPI inflator for our costs. Since then, we were coming back with our 18-month update, which we presented to Finance Committee, and we were showing a surplus projected at $3 million. And essentially that was all due to increased revenues and strong retail sales and property taxes. This next slide is showing the general fund revenue by category. And as you can see, two of the categories that we'll talk about that have been heavily impacted by the COVID crisis are the department revenues and sales tax. And they make up approximately 64% of the total revenues that the general fund relies on. And the total revenue for each of those areas for property taxes is 25.6 million, sales tax is 27.25, and then the total department revenues are 33.97 million. So when we're looking at these trends in these two scenarios, we're projecting an $8 to $13 million loss in revenue for fiscal year 2020. And the reason is it is a range is because we have the scenario where the shelter in place would end on May 3rd. And so that would result in an $8 million revenue loss. And then the shelter in place extending through June 30th would result in a $13 million revenue loss. And the table here shows what the June 30th estimate would be. And what we are looking at now at this point, what we know, June 30th is the most likely scenario. So this is most of the charts you'll see will focus on that data point. So from the 18-month projection, we're looking at a sales tax loss of 6.68 million. And for transient occupancy tax, a loss of approximately 800,000. And our department revenue, which is primarily arts and recreation, is 5.47 million. So our total projected loss, based on what we know now, is approximately 13 million. And so these next 4 slides are going to go through specific trends and assumptions for each of the major categories of revenues that we're talking about. And so this graph that you see shows a comparison of the long-term financial forecast that was adopted a year ago, which is your green line, the 18-month update, which is the blue line, and that stops because we didn't actually provide any projections at the 18-month. We were only going through fiscal year 1920, so that's why you see that line stop. There's no other hidden meaning there. So and then the financial trend analysis, which again is assuming that the shelter in place is lifted June 30th, is the red line. And so for the trends and assumptions on sales tax, for fiscal year 20, we're looking at an 80% reduction in sales tax for the duration of the shelter in place. And for the recovery for fiscal year 21, we're assuming a 70% recovery of lost sales tax through fiscal year 21. And just to provide a numerical example for the fiscal year 21 recovery, if we were to lose $1 million in fiscal year 20, then we would recover 700,000 of that over the course of fiscal year 21. That just provides some context on what that means. And these, just for your information, the assumptions do not include any potential sales tax deferments or other items, other programs that are out there on sales tax. Next, we'll look at transient occupancy tax. So here we're looking at an assumption of fiscal year 20, 100% reduction in transient occupancy tax for the duration of the shelter in place. And then for our fiscal year 21 recovery, 50% recovery in the quarter following the lifting of the shelter in place. And in this example, that again would be June 30. So we're looking at the quarter following that. And as you can see, the financial trend analysis is, even with the recovery, is still below what we were showing back when we did the long-term financial forecast. So for property tax, there's no impact in property tax until fiscal year 22, and that's a result of the way the assessed valuation is done, and then when that actually becomes sales tax remittances. So we're not looking at any impacts in fiscal year 20 or 21, but as you can see on the graph, the dip in fiscal year 22 will happen, and then it would continue to grow based on our assumptions. Department revenues. So again, this is primarily arts and recreation. So for fiscal year 20, we're assuming that there's no revenue for the duration of the shelter in place. And for the fiscal year 21 recovery, we're assuming that arts and recreation return to pre-COVID levels. So next, I'd like to go through some of the expense assumptions that we used when we did these scenarios. So for fiscal year 20, both personnel and non-personnel costs were projected to spend at budget. So essentially, our revised budget for fiscal year 20, we're assuming we're fully spending all of that. So again, that means that we have not put any cost-saving assumptions into these trends yet. For fiscal year 21, personnel, the COLAs based on recently adopted MOUs are included, as well as updated healthcare costs. And for our non-personnel costs, we kept that flat from fiscal year 20. For fiscal year 22 and beyond, the COLAs, again, are based on the recently adopted MOUs, and once those have expired in the out years, there's a 2.6% inflator, and then a 6% increase in healthcare costs. For non-personnel expenditures, costs are increased by a CPI of 2.6%. And as I mentioned earlier, the reserves are fully funded per the current policy. And again, just to reiterate, no balancing solutions have been applied in these scenarios. So this is the financial trend analysis scenario A, which is the shelter in place through May 3rd of 2020. And so what we're projecting here is a $5.5 million deficit in fiscal year 20, and that's a result of an approximately $8 million drop in revenues. And for fiscal year 21, we're looking at a $1 million deficit. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at scenario B as being the more likely scenario, and that's the shelter in place through June 30th of 2020. And for fiscal year 19-20, $10.2 million deficit is what we're projecting. And that's a result of a $13 million projected loss in revenues, which include $7 million loss in sales tax, $5.5 million loss in department revenues, and approximately $800,000 loss in transient occupancy tax. And then,
Mayor, I have a quick question. Sorry, I've raised my hand, but I think you've been busy just watching the presentations we all have. Kirsten, just quickly, regarding the end dates for the shelter in place, is that assuming, let's say it was May 3rd, that suddenly everything opens the way it was before, or June 30th, that everything was the way it was in February? Or does that assume that there is a gradual increase?
depending on the revenue stream, there is some gradual increases that are built in for after the shelter in place is lifted. So, for example, in the arts and rec revenue assumptions, we're assuming that once June 30th happens, that things will go back to normal. But now, knowing what we know now, we're also working on additional modeling, which we'll talk about further in the presentation on what would happen if that is not how it happened. And so the revenue assumptions would change in terms of a slow ramp up versus the lights come back on July 1 and everything resumes to normal.
Okay, so like sales tax, for example, it's understood that it's not going to come back at even a 70% level within that next few weeks.
Yes, at this point, yes. The scenarios that we were developing when we were putting this together, as I mentioned, the information is changing so rapidly that it was based on what we thought would happen, probably 3 weeks ago, when economists were looking at more of a V-shaped recovery where it would come back up more quickly. But now that we know more, we're going to look at additional scenarios where that's not quite the reality at this point.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Kirsten, if I could chime in just for a moment. We actually did assume there was a slow ramp up for both sales tax as well as TOT. We presumed that it would take multiple quarters for things to come back up. And I don't believe, Kirsten, correct me if I'm wrong, they even come back up to full levels in fiscal year 21. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it's not assumed that we just turn the lights on and we run. We had been hoping that Arts and Rec would be able to, once they got all clear, we'd be able to go back to our Broadway season, go back to our previously scheduled programming, literally. But we're going to have to go back and modify those. So we think there will be some change in the 21 numbers, primarily around how quickly Arts and Rec can bring back up their programming.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Okay, so in this scenario, for fiscal year 21, we're looking at a $2.2 million deficit. And again, it does not include any proposed balancing strategies. So next, I'm going to go over some of the budget strategies for consideration. And basically, these are options of strategies that could be used to close the budget gap in fiscal year 20. And there may be things on this list that council wouldn't consider. And then there may be some things that we have not thought of that should be added to this list. So we can go through these. So the strategies are categorized by their level of difficulty and whether they are ongoing or one time. So the first slide is showing the lowest level of difficulty. So I'll go through some of these, but I won't go through them in detail. But we have delay hiring, restrict to essential purchases only. And what that would mean is the purchases that are needed in order to keep things going, basically working within the current county order for essential services only. Suspend travel and training, eliminate any unspent carry forward. What that means is anything that has carried forward in the general fund from fiscal year 18-19 into 19-20, if it has not yet been spent, that could be, the appropriation could be eliminated, and that would help the general fund. And that includes purchase orders as well. The next item is use of reserves. And now you'll see that some of these, the first three have been implemented already as part of our approach, spending with caution at this point, based on what we knew. Once we realized this was a much bigger crisis, we already started to try to control what we were spending so that we could help out this current fiscal year. So the next slide shows the medium level of difficulty. So redirecting funding from existing capital projects. So in fiscal year 19-20, approximately 1.7 million was budgeted to be contributed towards capital projects. So to the extent that there's any of that that has not yet been spent or that could come back to the general fund, that's something that we would look at. Eliminating vacant positions, freeze vacant positions, reduce the general fund allocation to capital projects and infrastructure. And that's the ongoing piece of it where we have that budgeted in the out years. And to reduce facilities maintenance to essential only, and stopping pay for hourly staff, which again has already been implemented effective April 8th. Now, some of these, as I mentioned, are one time and some are ongoing. The $10 million gap we're talking about for fiscal year 20 is a one-time gap. And for the high level of difficulty, these would take much more consideration and possible renegotiating of labor agreements, but they would include deferring salary increases, deferring merit increases, a hiring freeze, eliminating programs and services, renegotiating those labor agreements, and then layoffs. So we've talked a little bit about reserves. So we have what we're showing here are 3 different categories of reserves that we have in the general fund. And as we've mentioned before, the Government Finance Officers Association, the recommendation is to have 2 months of reserves, which is roughly 18 to 20%. So in general, our emergency reserves that we're showing here, the 13.97 million, which is 15% of the general fund expenses, those are set up specifically for situations like this, where we have a crisis or a natural disaster. The next category of the other reserve designations, these are set up for specific purposes, but in the event that things become dire, they can be redirected towards assisting with balancing a budget gap. And then lastly, the pension reserves, which are restricted and can be used only for pension costs of 20.75 million. So in total, when we look at our reserves, we're talking about 45%, which is much higher than the recommended, closer to 20%. However, we would not necessarily have all of that available to us to close the budget gap. So for next steps, and Terry mentioned some of the dates coming up. So we're looking primarily at fiscal year 2020, which is the green. So on April 9th, we brought the projected deficits and budget balancing strategies that we've talked about tonight to Finance Committee. And then we're here tonight talking about that. And April 24th, we will bring to the Finance Committee the fiscal year 20 proposed reductions to try to solve this $10 million deficit. And the plan is then on May 5th to bring those same reductions to Council for consideration. And then beyond that, we will begin in earnest, as Terry mentioned, on the fiscal year 21 budget process. So when we brought this to Finance Committee, we're bringing forward the recommendations for approving the budget strategies as presented, using scenario B for fiscal year 20, which we feel is the most likely scenario at this point based on what we know. And then additional modeling is needed for fiscal year 21, which we are working on different recovery scenarios for fiscal year 21. So what we're asking of you tonight is to approve these budget balancing strategies as recommended by the Finance Committee. And that concludes our presentation, and staff is available to answer questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. I am sure that there will be questions, and yes, somebody actually now knows how to raise her hand. So I'm going to call on Councilmember Silva.
First, I want to say it was because there was no button for me to raise my hand because they had given me access to show that other screen. And so when you don't get both buttons. So Kirsten, thank you so much for your presentation, and Terry and Dan. And I truly appreciate the tables that you were showing us where we could compare the 18-month with where we're going in the future. And I also appreciate the answers to some of my questions that were in a memo to us today. I did have a couple of questions. It's related to the memo, but you didn't actually show a table. Did you, Kirsten? I want to ask about department revenues and the projections that you're showing in the table at the bottom of page 2 in the memo. And I can't remember if it was in the slide presentation.
We actually don't have that detail in the slide presentation, but let me pull that up.
We can talk about it at Finance Committee because it's really about the numbers projected for fiscal year 21. Something's wrong in that right-hand column and related to the department revenues. And so I think.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I have the numbers here for the department revenues for fiscal year 21. Are you looking at the scenario B for June 30th?
At both scenario A and scenario B, it looks like department revenues are estimated to be 27.6 million per year in both scenarios, but that is literally $8 million less than what they were projected to be this year, which makes the 1 million and the 2 million budget gaps projected for fiscal year 2021 not accurate. So, but we can resolve that later.
Okay.
And so just to be two things to verify, the projections that you showed us, or the trend analyses, really assumed a more V recovery, which was where people were maybe 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. And now we have to really, as Mayor Pro Tem Wilk pointed out, looking at a slower ramp up back to whatever we might achieve in the next fiscal year.
Yes, that's correct.
And I just want to verify one more time that the assumptions we have now are really assumptions about revenues and not about the expenses that are shown. Have no assumptions about any budget balancing or use, either increase in revenues from increases in fees, reduction in expenses, or use of reserves.
That is correct.
And my last question is, to what extent are we tracking the costs that we're expending for this pandemic, and what we need to do? Because those may be recoverable under emergency rules, but also one of those reserve categories, the catastrophic one, says we can use these in time of an epidemic, but it seems most appropriate for us to have a sense of how much we're spending on the epidemic when we discuss that.
Yes, we are tracking that. We have a mechanism in our financial system to track those costs. And so we are collecting those, and we have started collecting those from the beginning of this, which is, so it should help inform.
If I could, I would just like to add to that, one of the things that's fairly unique about this type of a disaster compared to something that I guess you could call more traditional in terms of a fire, an earthquake, or flooding, is that in those instances, there is usually a tremendous increase in expenditures in terms of responding to that emergency and then through the recovery effort of rebuilding. And from the federal government in terms of reimbursement, many of those costs are eligible. Historically, what has absolutely not been eligible is reimbursement for loss of revenue. And that's what's unique about this disaster, in that right now, certainly we've had some additional expense, but it's not all that much in the bigger scheme of things, the real hits on the revenue side. So with that in mind, that's really why the additional federal stimulus package, if it's version 4, that would allow for recovery of revenue, is so critical, because otherwise we won't be eligible for much on the expenditure side at this point, but we are tracking that.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Those are my questions for now, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Councilmember Francois.
Thank you, Mayor. I think the first question I have is for Kirsten. And I was curious as to how the current 21 projected deficit compares to the long-term financial forecast. I know the current projection is slide 26, and you had shown the long-term financial forecast, or Terry had earlier in the presentation.
So if I could just bring the presentation back up so we can take a look at that.
When I'm looking at the chart, Kirsten, it's right around 700,000, 600, 700,000. And that's remembering that we had a recession beginning in fiscal year 21. We were a couple months too late in our model for what we're actually experiencing, but that's part of the differentiation between what we had adopted in the long-term financial forecast versus what we're showing you now, is that there was a traditional recession plan.
So it's higher now, right, Terry? 2.2 now, and it was 700 under the long-term financial forecast?
Correct.
Okay. And then I had a question historically about use of reserves. When has the city tended to tap into those either financial or catastrophic reserves, if at all, during recessions or other downturns?
I might be able to answer that.
So I would defer to Dan on that, because I wasn't here.
I don't know that any of us were here. There's not much of a history of using reserves. I'll defer to Cindy in a moment, but not much of a history of using reserves. I think it was fairly minimal or no use even during the economic downturn. But obviously, this situation is considerably different. And I see that Councilmember Silva has her hand up here.
What I would say is that in 2009, we used what we saw as surplus from the previous budget cycle. We didn't send it to reserves, but we used it to smooth the path. And then in 2011, we came back as we were starting to come out of the recession. We shored up our policies, both in terms of how we calculated our reserves, but when, what, and what we would use them for, because we had watched our colleague cities across the state overusing reserves to the level that they basically went into bankruptcy, because it lasted a lot longer than anyone predicted.
So Cindy, no reserves were used at all, essentially, during the last downturn?
Technically, none were used, but again, there were surpluses. So there was revenue in a case where revenues exceeded expenses, and it was surpluses coming out of the 06-08 budget cycle. And the CAFR was approved in January, and there was just enough there, and we slid it forward and kind of smoothed our progress because our sales tax revenues at that time were plummeting.
Thank you. That's helpful. And then finally on the stimulus, assuming there is another package that's intended to aid smaller cities like Walnut Creek, does staff think it's realistic that that will be aimed at loss in revenues as opposed to expenditures? In other words, is it more realistic to assume that the federal government would structure it the same way they have for larger cities, and that only additional expenditures would be eligible for recovery?
Well, the current ask is that it would offset revenues because most cities or most municipalities are in this situation where while there are some expenditure increases for buying additional supplies, maybe some type of support to some organizations, the real impact is in loss of revenue. And so that is what the ask is. Now, as you can imagine, that's a little bit more difficult to calculate and to justify in terms of what we would have received if it were not for COVID-19. So I would imagine that if there is money made available, there'll be considerable strings tied to make sure that folks are following the rules and not taking advantage of that situation. But that is clearly the intent and the ask from the National League of Cities, the U.S. Mayors Conference and Association, the California League, and basically municipalities throughout the country requesting that very type of reimbursement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Wilk.
Thank you. And again, thank you to staff for all the work that you've been doing on this. Obviously, there's a lot of moving pieces. Just a couple of questions and more clarifications than anything else. On just what Matt and Cindy were saying, what specifically are the emergency reserves specifically noted to be used for? We got some generalities about this, but is there anything that it's actually laid out by items?
Yes, actually, there's a resolution that specifies what they can be used for, and it's part of the agenda report. It's attachment 2. So for each of the reserves or designations, it indicates what these can be used for. Was there a specific one you wanted additional information on?
No, really, I wanted, just so that people that haven't read the report that may be looking at this either right now or at a later time understand what those specifics are.
Yeah, I could just speak to that if you'd like without going into detail. There for this exact type of situation. There's the emergency reserve, whether it, and there is specifically pandemic called out for that. Also fire, flood, earthquake, severe locust, you name it, whatever the case may be, that we would use that. And the other is for emergency fiscal reserves, or when there is a large economic downturn, that if revenues drop by a certain percentage or certain types of expenditures were to increase that are out of our control, that we could utilize that reserve as well. In the current situation, given that we have a natural disaster that has subsequently triggered economic downturn, this situation qualifies for use of both of those reserves for that roughly $15 million, $14 million that's between those two.
Okay, all right, thank you. And seeing the fluidity of this situation, and obviously if we're meeting with the finance committee every couple of weeks and then there's a report back to the city council, things can change daily. I mean, we see them change hourly right now. I'm hoping, and just wanted to really look for confirmation on this, that you've got some kind of a pivot table or some kind of a Excel that you are plugging numbers in every day or every couple of days so that we're getting the most accurate information, because these graphs obviously look pretty static, but I understand that the situation is going to be completely different on Friday than it was on Monday.
So our financial trend analysis is a model. It's based on the long-term financial forecast. So we are constantly looking at that and putting those new inputs into that model so that we can see what's going on. And additionally, we're looking at just in terms of expenditures and revenues, looking at what we're seeing on a weekly basis coming into the city and what's being spent to make sure that we are on track.
Great. That's
Yeah,
the answer I wanted to hear.
Yeah, let me add to that if I could, Councilmember Wilk. So in addition, the past practice has been to provide a fiscal update to the council on every 6 months throughout a 2-year budget cycle. We are planning to modify that to provide updates on a quarterly basis, at least during this this downturn, and we may do it beyond that as just as an updated practice. But in addition, we're not going to wait for a quarterly update. If something changes and we need to apprise the council, we will come to council sooner than that, even calling special meetings if necessary, if the situation warrants. So I want to emphasize it's not standard practice. It's not business as usual. And we will be coming to either finance committee or council or both as needed and as frequently as necessary.
Great. Okay. Thank you. That's just what I wanted to hear. Appreciate it.
Any more questions from any of the council? Hearing none, I guess I can add my questions now, which is it's frequently a tendency when one does this to kind of almost always overstate revenues. And so my best initial professional experience concern is that the recovery that we're forecasting is still a little optimistic. And so do you have, where did the optimism come from? So with statistics like a huge proportion of our restaurants are going out of business and can't recover. There's just a lot of things that can happen. And then I just am concerned our revenues are overstated.
I'll jump in on that one. So for 20, I really don't think they are overstated. As I mentioned earlier, we've taken the TOT to zero. We've dropped sales tax from in the financial forecast, we've dropped it by, $5 or $6 million just for the 1 quarter. So we dropped it by 80%. Capturing just some minor activity where people are still buying toilet paper and eating out and things like that. There will be some activity, but we've zeroed out our departmental revenues practically, except for a little bit of development services money continuing. So, we might see a little bit of swing in fiscal year 20 on the revenues, but unlikely because we've zeroed it out. 21 may be a little optimistic yet. And that's where we're going to come back and have some more discussion with the finance committee on how much deeper we want to go into, or how much further out we want to stretch our recession assumptions, and are they deep enough? So they very well may not be deep enough for 21.
Okay. So in the budgeting balancing strategies, is that somewhere where you'd like us to give you feedback, or is it okay? So I have questions in order to give you feedback. One of the strategies that is offering early retirements, is there any feeling for how valid that, how much 1 or 2 people is not going to make a difference? And what do we replace that brain trust with that makes that a good thing?
You want to tackle that one, Terry, or? We don't know yet. And actually HR is working on some potential options and scenarios just to cost out what they might look like, so we could further consider those. And in the short term, it may not save money in the short term, but it could save some money in the longer run. And we do have the option, we'll see if Steve Mattis flinches at all here, but we do have the option of structuring who's eligible to make sure that it's equitable, but yet that certain folks maybe in key positions may not be eligible if we wouldn't want to lose a certain skill set. But that generally speaking, what this would allow is, and the thought is, if folks are thinking of retiring in the next, 1 to 2 years, if they were to accelerate that, it could considerably help the budget by freeing up some vacant positions for some cost savings. And then they still retire, but obviously there's an incentive to do so earlier than later. So that's a long way of saying that we're working on a few different scenarios. We don't yet know how many folks might be interested, but we can start having those conversations to see if it would make a significant difference or not.
Okay, and some of these things that are in the middle range, like reduce facilities maintenance to essential only. I'm sort of under the impression from years of hearing people worrying about balancing budgets that we were pretty close to that standard anyway. Is that a fair statement? And it's theoretically a good thing to do most of the time when money's really tight. But my concern is that we're putting these down as ideas, but they don't really make a big hit in the problem.
Yeah, the idea behind this is that we have the entire menu of options here, and what we're looking for, if you think we've missed an item on the menu, if you think there's something that should absolutely not be considered and taken off. Otherwise, what we would intend to do, and you'll see our plans in more detail tomorrow when we publish the staff report for the Finance Committee for Friday, is that we would be recommending that we use a variety of options from the different categories, particularly some in the medium and low for the 10 million. The high categories take more time and they will require further discussion, would be more appropriate for considering for fiscal year 21 if we feel we need to head to the high area after reviewing the numbers in more detail. But many of those are not even feasible. As you can imagine, we collectively only have here basically 2.5 months to close a $10 million gap. So we need to move quickly, and we will be using more one-time solutions to close this challenge in the current year because it is a one-time issue. However, going forward into FY21, it's more of an ongoing challenge, not so much a one-time issue. So we'll be shifting our strategies so that they are sustainable over the long haul.
Okay. I have a couple. The high category is the one that I have a couple of concerns about. How do we assure that we're administering it as fairly as we possibly can? And what do we do to establish standards to eliminate programs and services? As sometimes it seems like it costs more money to figure out what we should do than keep the programs going. And so I just, I am very concerned. Well, that's a comment, so I'm not going to go with it. All right. I'm going to do one more check to see if there are any hands up, and I see none. So I think it's now time for checking for public comments or questions. So City Clerk, would you please check the list and see if public comment is getting any bites?
We have received no written comments, and there's no members of the public in the queue to provide live public comments.
Great. If that's the case, I'm going to give council one more swipe at the question apple, and then I'm going to ask for their comments. So any more additional questions? I don't see everybody. I'm assuming no. And now for comments. Is anybody ready to lead the comments for the rest of the council? Okay, Cindy, you're a senior member, and by virtue of the fact that you've been on council the longest and have been through good times and bad, can I ask you to give your comments first, please?
I will be happy to. First of all, thank you to staff for everything you've done to try to figure out how to navigate this problem. This is not the way it was in late 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12. While it felt like it was happening quickly, it did not happen in 36 hours. And that's what this felt like, where we went from fully open to just plain shuttered and not sure what was going to happen. So this has had a dramatic impact on our psyches, on the psyche of the community, on our revenue streams in terms of sales tax and TOT, and huge questions because the timing being we're trying to close a budget cycle. So we have to get balanced in the next 75 days and then get ready for the next budget year makes this very, very complicated. It feels very different than it did in 2009 because we were mid-year and we were constantly just making adjustments, but not faced with a constitutional legal deadline of having to have it done other than what the bank wanted. So thank you to staff and for your thought on this, and thank you for showing the charts today. I think I would agree with the mayor. I think we have to be careful not to be overly optimistic for 21. I think $10 million does sound like the right target for 20, the gap we need to close. I think we need to be very cautious not to be overly optimistic because the speed of recovery is going to impede us because, Terry, as you said during the COVID presentation, 22 million Americans are out of work. That's 50% more than were out of work. Worst case in the Great Recession, and it happened in 4 weeks. People who are out of work are not spending money. They're not going out to dinner. They are just trying to figure out how they're going to pay their rent. And so I think this recession is going to hit very severely to us. And it's going to be slow to come back because we don't know how quickly people will get their jobs back because we really don't know what this social distancing problem is going to create. We have so many employees in the hospitality industry, food and beverage and hotels, and they work very close to each other. Dining tables are close to each other. We had a conversation earlier that the governor's office may in fact dictate that our restaurants will not have as many tables going forward, and that's going to impact everything. In addition, what this projection doesn't include is what's going to happen in a couple of years when CalPERS recalibrates as a result of its significant losses that it's taken in the market in recent days. And also not included is all of the sales tax that comes to us from road dollars, Measure Dre, the gas tax, and the SB1 funds. All of that is going to be impacted on our ability to maintain our roads. So all of this to say, we're going to have to be really overly cautious, probably without being catastrophically panicked. Yet it's better to underpromise and overdeliver than vice versa, because if you do it the other way, you end up in a world of fiscal hurt. Regarding these budget balancing strategies, I have just one comment that I think our use of reserves should be judicious. Some of our colleague cities would probably look at our $14 million in our fiscal and catastrophic emergency funds and say, oh, good, let's just go use that. We can solve the 10 million and maybe the 3 million in the next fiscal year after that. And then we'll just replenish it over time. Well, that replenishing over time will take a really long time, and it almost becomes the first thing you have to budget for in the future, not the last thing. So I think we have to be very judicious. And I think we are going to have to engage with the community for fiscal year 21, because if we're going to be looking at programs and services, what we did in 2009 is we did have a community engagement process. It wasn't quite as online as we can be now, But I would caution also we have to selectively pick that survey sample so that we get a true demographic sampling of seniors and young families, et cetera, if we're going to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask Councilmember Waddell. Would you please give your comments?
I'm not going to repeat much of what Ms. Silva said because I agree with most of it. I too have massive concerns about what's going to happen in the long term with CalPERS and what the hit and changes are going to be coming down to municipalities and how that's going to affect Walnut Creek. So we need to be thinking about that more in the long term. I also have major concerns that the projections that are being put forth are overly rosy. Even if we look at this from an end of 2021 perspective, getting 70% of our sales tax back, or sales tax base back, I think is quite aggressive. And my concern is that the longer we let this go on, the harder the cuts are going to be and the harder the changes are going to be. And then, of course, the harder the decisions are going to be. In my discussions previously with our city manager and other staff, I would hope as we look at the 2021 budget that we take more of a approach of not looking at what we're going to cut or what changes are going to occur second, and we'll look more at what principles that we're going to be basing our decisions on, so that if there are subsequent changes down the pike in 2021 or beyond, that we can go back to those principles rather than having to have this constant conversation or a constant debate amongst the council members about what our priorities are and what how we're going to be basing our thought processes off to be able to make these changes. I think just having point in time conversations, while necessary, kind of deviate and distract us from what we all hope to accomplish in the end, and kind of set us on different paths rather than walking down the same path together. Again, I won't repeat most of what Ms. Silva said because I agree with most of it.
Thank you. Next, Councilmember Francois. You're still muted.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I really want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think we're appropriately conservative for 20 and using the use of scenario B. And I appreciate you, Mayor, calling out that perhaps we're not being conservative enough in terms of our assumptions for 21. I think it is important that we tie that either to feedback from consultant, from what other cities are doing, or from what the league information they can provide. I know that most of it is somewhat of an educated guess now, but I think we should try to get that as right as we can. And I'm not sure the 70% rebound is the right number. So I appreciate you highlighting that. I absolutely think, this is an extraordinary circumstance, and thanks to the good leadership of all of you and our predecessors, we're in a better position than a lot of other cities, but we're not immune from a pandemic for sure. And I think that it's certainly an appropriate time to consider use of the reserves in the short term. But I think we might want to consider short term being both 20 and 21. Certainly not use of all of it, because it's going to be hard to rebuild that back up. But I appreciate Councilmember Silva's comment to be judicious, but I think these are extraordinary times too, and I think we have to balance those two competing interests. So I'm very appreciative of staff and the finance committee and the vetting that all of this gets before it comes to us, and the city manager's availability for my questions on this. So looking forward to rolling up my sleeves and getting to it. And I do think there's cause for optimism, because I think we are a very strong city. We were before. We'll rebound from this. And the benefit of the history that we have is that we have been through this before, as has our country. It was 100 years ago, but our city clerk was able to call out a resolution that was adopted by our predecessors then, and they weren't dealing with the same issues, but we got through it then, and we'll get through this now, and it's going to require some heavy decisions, but that's why we're elected to represent the people to make those. So I look forward to tackling those with all of you.
Thank you. And now Mayor Pro Tem Wolk.
Well, again, I appreciate all the work that staff has done on this. And I mean, this is obviously something that it's impossible to plan for, this kind of a complete economic collapse. I think a lot of what my thoughts were have already been said by the other council members, but just to kind of summarize, we are in better shape than a lot of other cities. We're a vibrant city, and we have been financially prudent in what we do with the way we spend, the way that we underestimate. So we have a surplus, and then we can put that into everything from a trust fund for our CalPERS payments, as well as our reserve funds. And I mean, the cities that don't have to worry about that with a downturn in sales tax and a downturn in program and services are those communities that are truly only bedroom communities, that nobody goes and shops there, and they don't have any programs and services. They're basically just for people to live. And there are some of those in our county, and that's great. They're not going to be affected in this same similar way. And we need to get back to where we know that everybody wants to be. There are some of the assumptions that are made, I think, that are optimistic. We talked about the 70% rebound. How quickly would that happen? Will people be more comfortable shopping online? And will there be a loss to that familiarity that is now for people to shop online and moving even further away from shopping in our stores? We don't know if that will all come back or how quickly it would come back. We also don't know if there's going to be retightening and loosening and using it as a toggle going back and forth as cases expand and contract. And that is a variable we just aren't going to know at this time. I think, as Dan had said at the very beginning, the numbers will be wrong because this is just a best guess right now, but it'll constantly be updated. And that's what we're going to have to pay attention to. The CalPERS and our unfunded liabilities were mentioned. That is a huge concern that's coming down the line. We're well set up, and I feel confident that we're well set up. But now CalPERS is going to have to look at this and probably make an adjustment in the next couple of years, and that's going to hurt cities even more. And we were already talking about how much this most recent discount rate cut was going to help hurt cities in the mid-20s. So these are all things that we have to consider. And I think in some areas, we're going to have to look at really the line by line, not just the arts and the arts programs or even the Lesher Center, but how these are all divided out. Because, I mean, we're going to be really slicing and dicing a lot of different ways and coming up with decisions that I think Councilmember Silva had mentioned earlier are going to be very difficult decisions. It's going to be hard and harder. And that's the decision that we have.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start with, actually, there is, I think, a bright side for this, and that is because people who have been housebound haven't spent money the way they used to, and there is some pent-up spending. It's like working a whole tax season. You're so busy from working through the tax season that you just don't even think about spending money. And then at the end of the tax season, you've got the best checking account that you're going to have all year. So I think there is some pent-up spending that will give us a little teeny boost when all of this kind of shakes out. I appreciate the fact that Council Member Silva pointed out we're getting sales tax not just from our direct sales tax, but from other sources. And it just makes a lot of sense that we're going to have to look at the whole picture and all the components a whole lot more in depth than we can do in order to get us through the next 75 days and in order to put together the start of the budget for 2021. I think there was in the presentation, there was some slippage between starting the fiscal year identification and using the end of the year as the fiscal year identification. But fortunately, I think you wound up at the right one when we were talking about the calculations. I think we have to look at cash flow more than we've ever had to look at before because of the way that the things that are happening beyond our control are happening. For example, the state issuing orders that you can defer this and you can do that. And we just kind of are the tail on the dog that just has to go with it. But I think we have to be very concerned about cash flow. I think patterns of purchasing are ultimately going to change, and how we are going to live is ultimately going to change for a more significant time than just next year. It's shaken my confidence that I can forecast what's going to happen for the next couple of years. And I look at the people and their passion for social distancing, and having learned that lesson, I don't think we're going to give it up all that quickly, with the one exception of grandparents and grandkids. The very minute they can hug each other, they're going to go back and do it. I certainly believe that we need to engage the community. These are really big decisions, some of them painful, and I do think that we need to look at the future. And as Mayor Pro Tem pointed out, we haven't even started to figure out if we should figure out any resurges and how the whole game finishes out. Because once they take off all the limits, there may be a big increase in cases, and we might be back exactly where we are for another couple of months. So I think this is just fraught with all kinds of terrible scenarios. I actually have a little concern with Council Members Waddell's statement about we should focus on principles, because we have focused on principles for all the 8 years, 7.5 years that I've been on council. And I think that the principles will apply as we go forward. And the trouble with trying to set a new, if there is in his idea, a new set of principles, is the same that happens with that very statement. Every council will have a different measure of how to do it right and how to adjust. And any principle that we set now can be overturned in the next election. So what we need to do is establish good reasons why we choose what we do, and then hope that our wisdom, I hope we have lots, our wisdom will be good guidance for the next councils to come. I think that's the end of my comments. One more opportunity for staff to ask any additional questions if they would like. Seeing none. Any other additional comments from my fellow colleagues?
I would say they're looking for a motion, and I'm happy to make one.
Please.
Move to receive the report and approve the identified strategies to solve the projected fiscal year 2020 deficit as recommended by the Finance Committee.
Second.
May I have a roll call?
Councilmember Silva?
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Wilk?
Aye.
Councilmember Francois?
Aye.
Councilmember Waddell?
Aye.
Mayor Haskew?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you. This is the first of a lot of very deep conversations and analysis, and I thank my fellow colleagues for doing it with great thoughtfulness and with great sensitivity. I think we're going to get there. And I think we're going to get there well. And I thank the staff for all they have done. I've been on the side of preparing those numbers, and I know how really difficult and how hard they had to work to come up with the answers. That being said, I look forward to seeing everybody at our next regular meeting on May 5th, and this meeting is now adjourned.